morning Raymond Calloway left, Clara did not cry. She stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee growing cold in her hands and watched his truck move down the dirt road, kicking up a thin cloud of dust that hung in the air long after the truck itself had disappeared. The dust settled eventually. Everything settles eventually. But the quiet that replaced it was the kind that pressed against the walls, that made even the sound of a spoon against a ceramic mug feel too loud. She had known something was ending for a long time, not in the dramatic way people sometimes describe it in stories, where there is a single terrible moment that changes everything. It had been slower than that, a long, gradual cooling, like a fire that nobody bothers to feed. Raymond had stopped talking to her the way he used to talk to her. He had stopped asking how her day was. He had stopped sitting beside her in the evenings. He ate quickly, went to bed early, and got up before she woke. And then one morning he was simply gone. He had left the deed to the farm on the kitchen table, signed over in his neat, tight handwriting. Beside it was a white envelope with her name on it. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with 2 sentences. He said he was sorry. He said he needed something different. That was all. Clara read it 3 times. Then she folded it, put it back in the envelope, and placed it in the drawer beneath the silverware tray. She poured her cold coffee down the drain, made a fresh cup, and sat down at the kitchen table. The farm was hers now. All of it. 47 acres of broken promises and overgrown ambition. The house with its leaking roof and the peeling paint on the shutters. The barn that leaned slightly to the east as though it was tired and looking for somewhere to rest. The fences that had not been properly maintained in 3 years. The fields that Raymond had stopped planting 2 seasons ago when the debt started piling up and his interest in the land started falling away. Clara was 41 years old. She had not grown up on a farm. She had grown up in a small town about 60 miles north, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a man who fixed appliances. She had met Raymond at a county fair when she was 24 and he was 27, and she had thought at the time that he was the most confident person she had ever encountered. He knew things. He knew how to fix engines, how to read weather patterns, how to talk to anyone without awkwardness. She had fallen for that certainty of his, the way it filled a room. But certainty, she had learned over 17 years of marriage, is not the same as steadiness. Raymond was certain, but he was not constant. He moved through enthusiasms with great energy, and then abandoned them when they stopped exciting him. He had been passionate about the farm for the first 5 years. Then the passion faded, and the work was still there, and his interest in doing the work without the passion had never been strong enough to sustain it. He had let things go, and somewhere in the process of letting the farm go, he had let her go too. She was not going to cry about it, not yet, maybe later, when she was alone in a different kind of quiet. But right now, with the morning sun moving through the kitchen window and the deed to the farm sitting on the table in front of her, she felt something that surprised her. She felt, underneath the sadness and the shock, a small, stubborn thing that she could only describe as clarity. The farm was hers. Whatever she chose to do with it was her decision alone. Nobody was going to tell her she was wrong. Nobody was going to walk away from her choices with a tight jaw and quiet resentment. The weight of trying to please someone who could not be pleased had been sitting on her for so long that she had stopped noticing it. Now it was gone, and she could feel its absence as clearly as she could feel the morning air through the open window. She picked up the deed and looked at it for a long moment. Then she got up, walked to the small desk in the hallway where she kept her papers, and filed it carefully in the folder marked important documents. She would figure out what to do. She always figured out what to do. Her sister Helen arrived 2 days later. Helen was 3 years older than Clara, sharp-eyed and practical in the way that older siblings sometimes are, having watched their younger ones make choices they would not have made themselves. She drove out from the city on a Tuesday morning with a bag of groceries, and a look on her face that Clara recognized immediately. It was the look of a person who has already made up her mind about something and is simply waiting for the right moment to say it. They walked the property together after lunch. Helen put on her boots and did not complain about the mud, but she observed everything quietly and carefully. She looked at the fence lines. She looked at the barn. She stood in the middle of one of the fields and pressed her boot down into the soil, testing it. She looked at the roof of the house from the yard, shielding her eyes with her hand. When they went back inside and sat down with their tea, Helen wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at Clara the way she had looked at the property, quietly and carefully. She said that the place needed a lot of work. She said that it was going to cost money that Clara did not currently have. She said that land prices in the county had gone up, and that if Clara sold now, she would get enough to pay off the remaining mortgage, settle Raymond's debts, and still have something left over to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere smaller, somewhere easier. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. She let Helen finish completely, then she picked up her mug and took a slow sip of tea. She said she was not going to sell. Helen looked at her for a moment and then said, with real concern in her voice, that she just wanted Clara to be realistic. That wanting to stay and being able to stay were two different things. That the farm had beaten Raymond, who had grown up on land and knew what he was doing, and that Clara had never farmed a day in her life. Clara agreed that she had never farmed a day in her life. She said that was going to change. Helen stayed for 4 days. She helped Clara clean out some of the rooms that had fallen into disorder. She helped her make a list of things that needed to be fixed, organized, from most urgent to least urgent, and beside each item, they wrote a rough estimate of what the fix would cost. The list was long and the costs were daunting. Helen made a face when she looked at the final total. Clara looked at it differently. She looked at it the way you look at a problem you intend to solve. After Helen left, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time. The house was quiet around her. Outside, the wind moved through the long grass in the east field, and she could hear it through the window she had left slightly open. It was not an unpleasant sound. It was actually, she realized, a sound she had always liked but had never had the space to notice before, because there had always been something else filling the air. Raymond's television, Raymond's phone calls, the low background noise of a marriage that had long since run out of things to say. She took out her legal pad and wrote at the top of the page, in her own neat handwriting, a simple question. She wrote, "What do I actually know how to do?" The list she made beneath that question was honest and unsentimental. She knew how to manage money carefully, because she had been doing the household accounts for 17 years and had become very good at making small amounts stretch. She knew how to organize. She knew how to learn things from books and videos and patient teachers. She had a bookkeeping certification that she had earned 8 years ago and never really used, because Raymond had not wanted her to work outside the home once the farm started demanding more time. She turned the page and wrote another question. She wrote, "What do I need to learn?" The second list was much longer than the first. But as she wrote each item down, she felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. Something that felt like the beginning of motion after a long stillness. She was going to stay. She was going to figure it out. And the first thing she was going to do, before she let herself think too hard about what she did not yet know, was to fix the roof. The roof had been leaking in 2 places for over a year. Raymond had patched one of them poorly and promised to do the other one when he got around to it. He never got around to it. Every time it rained, Clara put a pot on the floor of the upstairs hallway to catch the drip. And every time it rained, she thought about asking Raymond again. And every time she stopped herself because asking him a third time would have started a conversation she did not have the energy for. Now there was nobody to ask. There was only the roof and the leak and her. She called 3 roofing companies from the county directory. 2 of them came out to give her estimates. The second one, a man named George who ran a small crew and had been fixing roofs in the county for 20 years, looked at what needed to be done and gave her a price that was fair. She knew it was fair, because she had spent 2 evenings reading about roof repair costs online, and fair was exactly what it was. She hired George. She paid the deposit from her savings account, the one she had kept quietly in her own name since the beginning of the marriage, adding to it slowly and carefully over the years with the modest personal income she had earned from various small bookkeeping jobs done from home. Raymond had known the account existed. He had not known how much was in it, because he had never asked. George and his crew arrived on a Thursday morning when the sky was clear and the forecast promised 3 dry days. Clara made coffee and offered it to them, and George accepted with the ease of a man who has spent his whole life doing honest work and knows how to receive a small courtesy without making it strange. She watched them work for a while from the yard, and she paid attention. She asked George questions, not too many, but enough. She wanted to understand what they were doing and why. George did not seem to mind the questions. He had a way of explaining things plainly, without condescension, and Clara liked him for it immediately. By the end of the first day, both leaks had been addressed, and by the end of the second day, a section of the roof that had been quietly deteriorating above the back bedroom was also replaced. Clara stood in the backyard as George's crew packed up their tools and looked at the new shingles in the late afternoon light. They were darker than the old ones, and the contrast was visible. It looked, she thought, like a repair, like someone had looked at the problem and done something about it. That evening, she sat on the porch as the sun went down and felt the specific satisfaction of a person who has taken one step and knows there are many more steps ahead, but is no longer standing still. The farm was going to need much more than a new roof. The fence lines on the north side of the property were down in 3 places. The posts rotted at the base. The well pump was making a sound that no pump should make, a grinding, reluctant sound that suggested it was working much harder than it should. The barn needed new boards on the east-facing wall where the wood had split and bowed away from the frame. The tractor, a a machine that Raymond had bought with great enthusiasm 6 years ago and maintained with decreasing interest after that, sat in the barn in a state of uncertain health. But the roof was fixed. And that was the first thing. Clara had learned, in her 41 years, that the only way to approach an impossible list is to treat it as a series of very possible individual tasks. You do not fix a farm. You fix a roof. Then you fix a fence. Then you figure out what is wrong with the well pump. You do not look at the whole mountain. You look at the next step. She was good at that kind of thinking. It was perhaps the most useful thing she had, and she was grateful for it now more than she had ever been. Over the following weeks, she established a routine. She woke early, before the light was fully up, and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with her notebook. She wrote down what she planned to do that day, and she was specific about it. Not fix fences, but walk the north fence line and count the damaged posts and measure what I need. She had read enough about projects to know that vague intentions produce vague results. She was not interested in vague results. She drove into town twice a week, once for supplies and once for the part-time bookkeeping work she had picked up at a small accounting firm that had been glad to have her. The work paid enough to keep a steady trickle of income while she worked on the farm, and being in an office 2 days a week, around other people with ordinary working lives, turned out to be more important to her emotional steadiness than she had expected. The woman who owned the firm was named Patricia, and she was 60 years old and had been running the business alone since her husband retired to pursue golf with a dedication that Patricia found both admirable and baffling. Patricia had a dry sense of humor and a memory for numbers that Clara respected immediately. They got along easily, in the way that two practical women often do, without drama or performance, simply getting things done and occasionally making each other laugh. Patricia did not ask Clara about the farm or the separation in the first weeks, but one afternoon, when they were both working late and had ordered sandwiches from the place down the road and were eating at their respective desks, Patricia put down her sandwich and looked over at Clara and said that she had heard she had kept the farm. Clara said yes. Patricia nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something she had already suspected. She said that was a smart decision, in her opinion. Then she picked up her sandwich and went back to her columns, and that was all she said about it. Clara drove home that evening with the windows down, even though the air had the edge of approaching autumn in it. She passed the turn onto the county road and felt the particular sensation of turning toward something rather than away from it. The farm appeared at the end of the long driveway as it always did. A collection of structures in varying states of repair, set against the long open sky. It looked like a lot of work. It also, for the first time, looked like hers. She parked the truck and got out and stood in the yard for a moment before going in. The wind was moving through the trees at the edge of the property. The barn door, which she had fixed the hinge on that past weekend, hung straight. Small things, but she had done them. Inside, she fed her dog, a quiet and steady black dog named Pepper who had belonged to both of them but had, without anyone making a formal arrangement about it, simply stayed. Pepper followed her through the house with the calm, purposeful energy of a dog who has decided that where this person goes, he goes too. Clara was grateful for him in a way that was difficult to put into words. He was company without complication. He was warmth without demand. And on the evenings when the house felt too large and too quiet around her, he would come and sit beside her on the couch and put his heavy head on her knee and look at her with eyes that seemed to understand that sometimes the best help a person can give is simply to stay. She made dinner, something simple, and ate it at the kitchen table while she read through a library book she had borrowed about soil management and cover crops. She was working her way through the agricultural section of the county library with the kind of methodical determination she usually applied to problems she intended to solve. Some of the books were dry and technical, and she had to read certain passages twice or 3 times before the meaning settled in. Others were written by people who clearly loved the land and wrote about it in a way that made the technical information come alive. She was beginning to understand things. The way that soil is not simply dirt but a living system. The way that what you plant in a field changes what the field can do next season. The way that a farm is not a collection of separate problems but an interconnected system in which everything affects everything else. She found this idea, once she understood it, genuinely fascinating. She had always liked systems. She had always liked understanding how things worked and what happened when you changed one part of the whole. The farm was a system. She was learning its language. And slow as it was, and hard as it sometimes was, she felt the particular satisfaction of someone who was doing exactly the right thing in exactly the right place, even when she was exhausted and unsure and very far from certain that it would all work out. The days had a weight to them, but it was a good weight. The weight of things that matter. She thought about Raymond sometimes, not constantly, and less as the weeks went on, but sometimes. She thought about the 17 years and all the small, ordinary moments that had made up most of them. She thought about the early years when the farm had been exciting, and he had been eager, and she had loved him in the straightforward, full-hearted way of someone who has not yet learned how complicated love can become. She did not hate him. She did not think hate was the honest response to what had happened. She thought the honest response was closer to sorrow, for what they had both invested and what they had both lost, and what had not, in the end, been enough to hold them together. But she did not stay in that thought for long. There was too much to do, and the doing of it was better for her than the thinking. Outside, the season was changing. The mornings were cooler. The light had shifted to that particular autumn quality that made everything look slightly golden, slightly past its peak, beautiful in the way of things that know they are temporary. Clara stood on the porch each morning with her coffee and watched the light move across the fields, and she breathed the cool air, and she let herself be exactly where she was. The farm was not fixed. Not by a long way. The list was still long. The money was still tight. The questions were still many. But the roof was not leaking anymore. The hinge on the barn door was straight. And the woman who had been left behind was still here, still standing, still holding her coffee in both hands and watching the morning come in across her land. She was not going anywhere. 6 weeks after Raymond left, Clara sat on the floor of the upstairs hallway with a yellow notepad on her knee and a flashlight in her hand, making a list of everything that was wrong with the house itself. She had already cataloged the outbuildings. She had walked the fence lines. She had talked to a mechanic about the tractor and had gotten a frank assessment of what it would take to get it running reliably again. Now it was the house, room by room, surface by surface, honest and without sentiment. The hallway floor had 3 boards that moved when you stepped on them. The bathroom window would not close fully, and the frame around it had softened where moisture had gotten in. The kitchen ceiling had a brown stain in the corner above the refrigerator that told the story of a previous leak. One that George had fixed during the roofing work but whose evidence still remained on the plaster above. The back bedroom closet had no rod because Raymond had pulled the original one out years ago, intending to build a better system, and had never replaced it. A stack of his remaining clothes still sat in boxes on the closet floor, clothes he had not taken when he left. She looked at the boxes for a moment, then she carried them downstairs, one at a time, and put them in the corner of the back hall. She would call and ask him what he wanted to do with them. That was the practical thing to do. And she was committed to being practical. The call, when she made it 2 days later, was brief and without drama. Raymond's voice was carefully neutral, the voice of a person being very deliberate about not giving anything away. He thanked her for calling. He said he would arrange to have someone pick up the boxes. He asked if she needed anything. She said she was fine. He said good. There was a pause, and then they both said goodbye. She hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she washed her hands, which she had not needed to wash, and went back to her notepad. The clothes were picked up a week later by a man she did not recognize, who arrived in a plain car, loaded the boxes into the trunk without saying much, and left. Clara watched from the window and felt nothing in particular, or rather, she felt a small, clean finality, the way you feel when a task has been completed and can be crossed off the list. That chapter, she thought, was a box that had now been taken away. Good. What remained was everything she had chosen: the farm, the work, the life she was going to build from the pieces of the one that had come apart. Her neighbor, Elliot, had lived on the adjacent property for over 50 years. He was 80 years old, lean and weathered in the way of men who have spent their lives outdoors, with hands that looked like they had been made for the specific purpose of working with soil and wood and metal. He had known Raymond's father before Raymond, and he had watched the farm change through 3 generations with the patient attention of someone who understands that land outlasts the people on it. He came over one morning about a month after Raymond left, carrying a jar of honey from his own hives, and knocked on the back door the way that neighbors knock when they know you well enough not to use the front. Clara let him in and made tea, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked for a while about general things before Elliot got around to what he had actually come to say. He said he had heard she was planning to stay on. She said yes, she was. He looked at her with his steady, unhurried eyes and said that was good. He said the farm had been let go some and would need attention, but that the land itself was still good land. He said that if she wanted, he was willing to talk to her about what it needed. Not to run things for her, he was clear about that, but to share what he knew if she wanted to hear it. Clara looked at him for a moment and then said she would like that very much. Elliot nodded once, finished his tea, and said he would come by Saturday morning. He said to wear boots she did not mind getting dirty. Then he got up, put his cup in the sink the way people do when they are comfortable in a kitchen, and walked back out the way he had come. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear, and Elliot was at the back door at 7:30 with his own boots already muddy and 2 cups of coffee in a thermos. They walked the property together for 3 hours. Elliot moved at a pace that was neither slow nor fast but simply efficient. And he talked as they walked, but not too much. He stopped at specific places and showed her things she would not have known to look at. He crouched down at the edge of the east field and picked up a handful of soil and crumbled it between his fingers and told her what he saw there. He showed her where a drainage issue was causing the ground near the barn to stay wet longer than it should, and he explained what that would mean over time if it was not addressed. He showed her which of the fences were merely worn and which were genuinely compromised. He showed her the one section of the property where the soil was particularly rich, and told her that if she was going to plant anything in the coming season, she should start there. He talked about the water table and the way the land tilted slightly toward the south, which affected where water moved in heavy rain. Clara listened and wrote things in her notebook. She asked questions when she had them, and Elliot answered them without making her feel foolish for asking. He had a gift for explaining without lecturing, for sharing knowledge in a way that felt like conversation rather than instruction, and she found that she liked learning from him very much. At one point, they stopped at the edge of the property where a row of old oak trees marked the boundary, and Elliot looked out across the neighboring field, which was his, well-maintained and planted in orderly rows. He said, without looking at her, that the farm had good bones. He said it was a word people used about old houses, but it applied to land too. The fundamentals were sound. The history of the soil was not bad. What it needed was consistent attention, and that was something time and will could provide. Clara looked out across his field and then back at hers, and for the first time she saw them as comparable. Different in their current state, yes, but made of the same materials, the same kind of land. She had been looking at hers and seeing only what was wrong. Now, standing beside Elliot and looking at both, she could see what it could become. She thanked him when they got back to the house, and he waved off the thanks the way people who are genuinely helpful sometimes do. He took his thermos and went back across the fence that separated their properties, and Clara watched him go with a feeling that she could only describe as gratitude of an unusually solid kind. Not the grateful feeling you have for a polite gesture, but the grateful feeling you have when someone gives you something you actually needed. She spent the rest of that Saturday making a different kind of plan. Not a repair list this time, but a growing plan. She sat with Elliot's observations and her library books spread across the kitchen table, and worked out what she might realistically do with a small portion of the east field in the coming spring. She was not thinking about profit yet. She was thinking about learning. She wanted to grow something and see it through from planting to harvest, not because she expected it to make money but because she needed to understand the full process. She needed to know what it felt like to put something into the ground and tend it and bring it to completion. She decided on a kitchen garden to begin with, something on the south-facing strip behind the house where the soil, according to Elliot, was warm and well-drained. Tomatoes, herbs, zucchini, because it was famously hard to kill, and a row of sunflowers along the fence, because she wanted them, and wanting something without needing to justify it was a habit she was consciously rebuilding. The tractor situation resolved itself that week, not entirely, but enough. The mechanic, a quiet man named Dennis who ran a small repair shop on the far side of town, had been honest with her about what the machine would cost to bring into fully reliable condition, and had also been honest about what was the minimum needed to get it functional for lighter work. Clara chose the middle option. She could not afford the full restoration, but she needed the machine to be able to move without anxiety. Dennis did the work over the course of a week and showed her, when she came to pick it up, what he had done and why, and what she should watch for going forward. She drove it back herself, which she had never done before, and the experience was more alarming than she had expected and also more satisfying. The machine was loud, and the steering was heavier than she had anticipated, and she took the county road slowly with her heart beating somewhat faster than usual. But she made it back without incident and pulled it into the barn and sat on it for a moment in the dim light of the barn, engine off, listening to it tick as it cooled. She had driven a tractor. She had also hired a roofer, negotiated with a mechanic, walked the full property with a farmer who had been doing this longer than she had been alive, and filed the paperwork to remove Raymond's name from the property deed. She had done all of these things in the space of 2 months, and while she was tired, in a way that went into her bones, she was also awake in a way that she had not been in years. The days were getting shorter now. The mornings arrived with frost at their edges, and the light had that particular slant of autumn going into winter. Clara added a second layer of clothing to her morning walks around the property, and she could see her breath in the air as she moved. Pepper ran ahead of her through the long grass, nose to the ground, busy with the urgent business of smelling everything. On one of those mornings, walking the north fence line to check the posts she was planning to replace before winter set the ground, she stopped and stood still for a moment in the middle of the open field. The sky was very large above her and very clear. The air was cold and clean. The farm spread out around her in every direction, all its imperfections and all its potential visible at once. She thought about the woman she had been when Raymond's truck disappeared down the road. That woman with the cold coffee and the folded letter and the stillness that had felt, in that first moment, like loss. And she thought about who she was now, standing in her field in the early morning, with her notebook in her pocket, and mud on her boots, and a growing sense of what she was capable of. Those two women were the same woman, she knew that, but the distance between them already felt like more than 2 months. It felt like the beginning of something that had no proper name yet, something she would have to live a little longer to understand. She started walking again. There were posts to check, a winter to prepare for, a list on the kitchen table that got crossed off one item at a time. She walked forward across her land and the cold morning air moved around her, and above her the sky was enormous and open, and entirely without limit. The winter arrived without mercy and without ceremony. One morning Clara woke to a world that had changed overnight, the fields white, the air sharp enough to hurt if you breathed it too quickly. The dirt road to the county highway glazed with a thin skin of ice that caught the early light and threw it back. She stood at the kitchen window in her wool socks and her heavy sweater, and looked out at the transformation and thought, with deliberate calm, that she was going to need to handle this. She had known winter was coming, of course. She had spent the autumn preparing for it with the focused energy of someone who understands that preparation is what stands between manageable difficulty and genuine crisis. She had insulated the crawl space beneath the house, a job she had done largely herself, with guidance from a video she had watched 6 times, until she understood every step. She had wrapped the outdoor pipes with foam insulation that Dennis at the repair shop had told her about when she mentioned her concern. She had stacked wood along the south wall of the barn, splitting a good portion of it herself, with a technique she had learned from Elliot and practiced until her arms ached, and then practiced more, until the technique became natural. She had laid in supplies. She had a chest freezer in the basement, newly stocked. She had dry goods in the pantry that she had organized with the same attention to order she brought to everything. She had made sure the truck was in good working condition before the first serious cold arrived, having taken it to Dennis for a winter check, and done everything he recommended. She had done all of this. And still, the winter was harder than she had expected. The pipes in the east wall of the house froze on a Tuesday night in January, when the temperature dropped well below what had been forecast. Clara discovered this at 6 in the morning when she turned on the kitchen tap and nothing came out. She stood very still for a moment, listening to the quality of silence around her, and then she put on her coat and her hat and her thickest gloves and went to the basement to see what she was dealing with. What she was dealing with was a frozen section of pipe in the east wall. The wall she had not thought to prioritize when insulating because it had not occurred to her that it was the most exposed. She knew this now. She was learning everything about the house by encountering its weaknesses one at a time, which was not the most comfortable method but was, she was beginning to understand, the most thorough. She knew that the wrong response to a frozen pipe was heat applied too quickly. She had read about this. She got a hairdryer from the bathroom and worked slowly and patiently, moving the warmth back and forth along the pipe from the end nearest the tap toward where she suspected the freeze was, not rushing, not panicking, talking herself through the process in a low, steady voice. After 40 minutes that felt considerably longer, the tap upstairs produced a sound, and then a trickle, and then a full stream. Clara sat on the basement floor and let out a very long breath. She then spent 2 hours reinforcing the insulation around that wall with materials she had in the barn, making the fix more permanent, thinking all the while about how the house was teaching her, slowly and through inconvenience, everything she needed to know about it. The ice storm came the 3rd week of January. 3 days of freezing rain that turned the entire farm into something that would have been beautiful if it had not been so dangerous. The trees wore coats of ice. The fence posts were encased in it. The path from the back door to the barn was a slope that required careful navigation with a rubber grip mat she laid down each morning and brought in each night so it would not freeze to the ground. The power went out on the 2nd day and did not come back for 4 days. Clara had not been entirely without resources for this. She had a wood stove in the living room, one of the old features of the house that Raymond had considered removing in favor of gas heating, and which she had been quietly glad he had not gotten around to. She had the stacked wood. She had candles and 2 good lanterns and a battery-powered radio. She had pepper. But 4 days without electricity in January in a farmhouse is its own kind of education. The refrigerator was not a concern in this particular cold. She simply moved certain things to the porch. The water continued to run, which she considered a victory. The stove in the kitchen was gas, so she could cook. But the house without its full heating was cold in a way that required active management, moving the warmth from the wood stove through the rooms by opening doors, keeping the internal doors closed at night to contain the heat in the living room and the kitchen. She slept on the couch beside the stove those 4 nights, with Pepper pressed against her legs, and the weight of him was a comfort she did not try to rationalize. She read by lamplight until her eyes grew tired, and then lay listening to the ice move in the trees outside. And sometimes she was fine and sometimes she was not. There was one night, the 3rd night, when the cold was at its worst and the lantern light was very small against the darkness of the room, and she thought about Raymond in a way she had not permitted herself to think about him in weeks. She did not think about him with anger. She thought about him with a hollow, simple sadness, the sadness of a person who realizes that the thing they are missing is not a specific person, but the general warmth of having someone there, the company, the second voice in the house, the way another person, even one who had stopped being fully present, changes the texture of a space simply by existing in it. She felt that absence more clearly those 4 nights than she had in months, and she let herself feel it without trying to argue herself out of it, because she had come to understand that feelings did not respond well to argument. You had to let them come, acknowledge them, and then continue. She continued. On the 5th morning, the power returned. The lights came on and the refrigerator hummed and the heat kicked in, and Clara stood in the kitchen in the sudden warmth and felt something that was very close to triumph. She had been tested, she had managed, the farm had tried its worst on her and she had gotten through it with her pipes intact, her food supply secure, her wood stove burning steadily, and her essential self unbroken. She made the most extravagant breakfast she could put together to celebrate. Eggs from her small flock of hens, toast with butter, coffee made strong and hot, and she ate it slowly at the kitchen table with Pepper watching her from his bed in the corner with the satisfied look of a dog who knows the difficult thing has passed. She called Helen that morning. Helen asked how the storm had been. Clara told her about the ice and the power cut, and the frozen pipes, and the 4 nights on the couch by the wood stove. She told all of it plainly, and without drama. Helen listened and then said, in a voice that had something new in it, that she had to admit she was impressed. Clara said she was a little impressed with herself too. Helen laughed, and then Clara laughed, and it was one of the better moments of the winter. The days after the storm were the kind that come as a reward for endurance. The sky cleared to a blue so sharp it almost hurt to look at. The ice on the trees caught the sunlight and threw rainbows in every direction. The air was still cold, but the wind had stopped, and the world had the particular silence of deep winter after storm, a silence that felt not empty but full, packed with something she could not name but was glad to be inside of. She went out to check on the chickens, who had weathered the storm in their insulated coop with what appeared to be the supreme indifference of animals who trust their housing without needing to understand it. She checked the barn. She walked the fence lines to assess ice damage. One section of fence near the north boundary had a post that had cracked under the weight of ice, and she noted it in her book without distress. She would fix it in the spring. That was a spring problem. This was January. She had learned, over these months, the vital art of categorizing problems by season. Some things were urgent and had to be addressed immediately. Some things were important but could wait for the right conditions. And some things were spring problems, and treating them as anything other than spring problems was a waste of energy that winter required for other purposes. Elliot came by the week after the storm to check in. He brought a jar of maple syrup he had put by from the previous spring, and they sat in the kitchen and talked about the storm and the farm and the season. He said she had handled it well, which from Elliot was a significant statement, delivered with his characteristic lack of fuss. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. He mentioned, that morning, that he had seen her light on at unusual hours during the storm. He said it in a passing way, not intrusive, just noticing. Clara understood that this was his way of saying he had been keeping an eye out, that the light from her window had told him she was all right and he had been glad to see it. She found that this small piece of information, that someone nearby had noted her light and been reassured by it, settled something in her that she had not known was unsettled. She was not as alone as the winter silence sometimes suggested. Elliot was across the fence. Patricia was a phone call away. Helen checked in twice a week now, their conversations warmer and less cautious than they had been in the early months. She had people. Fewer than some, perhaps, but real. That was more than enough. The weeks of deep winter had a rhythm to them that was almost monastic in its regularity. She rose early and tended the animals and checked the property and did her indoor work, the bookkeeping and the planning and the reading. She went into town twice a week and worked at Patricia's office and occasionally had lunch with Patricia or with a woman she had met at the office named Louise, who had a quick laugh and an interest in everything, and whose company Clara found consistently restorative. She planted nothing. It was winter, and the ground was frozen, and there was nothing to plant. But she planned. She spread seed catalogs across the kitchen table on evenings when the wind came up, and read them with the attention of someone who has developed a genuine appetite for a subject they had not expected to find interesting. She ordered seeds in February, choosing carefully, staying within what Elliot had told her was realistic for a first serious planting season. She did not overreach. She was learning to want the right-sized version of things. She also began, that winter, to repair things inside the house that she had previously only added to the list. She painted the hallway on a cold Saturday when going outdoors felt more punishing than productive. The paint was a warm white, and when she finished and stepped back to look at it, she felt the quiet pleasure of a small transformation, achieved through nothing more than her own will, and 2 hours with a roller. She replaced the missing rod in the back bedroom closet. She fixed the bathroom window so that it closed properly against the cold. She stripped and sanded and refinished the kitchen table that had belonged to Raymond's family and which she had always loved despite its associations, because the thing itself was beautiful, and she was not going to let her feelings about who had owned it deprive her of something beautiful. The winter was long, and it was sometimes lonely, and it was sometimes very hard. But it was also, beneath all of that, a period in which Clara Calloway was becoming something. She was becoming more fully the person she had always had the capacity to be. A person of practical intelligence and genuine resilience. A person who learned things and fixed things, and got through difficult nights and got up the next morning and started again. February gave way to March with the grudging, incremental thaw of a long winter finally loosening its grip. The ground was still frozen, but the mornings began to smell different, a particular freshness in the air that promised something. She noticed it during her morning walks, the way the world was beginning to prepare for a different season, slowly and beneath the surface, in ways you could not see yet but could feel. She stood one morning at the edge of the east field, the one Elliot had told her was where she should start, and looked at it. Frozen now, still. But underneath it, the soil was waiting, full of whatever it had been accumulating through the winter. She would come back to this field in spring. She would bring seeds and tools and whatever she had learned from the books and from Elliot and from the land itself. She would put things in the ground and tend them and see what grew. She had no guarantee it would work. But she had learned, over this long winter, that the absence of a guarantee was not the same as the absence of a reason to try. She had fixed the roof without knowing she could do it. She had survived 4 nights without power, without knowing in advance that she was capable of it. She had rebuilt her daily life without knowing, when she first sat at the kitchen table with Raymond's note in her hand, whether she was capable of rebuilding anything at all. She had done all of it. And the east field was just the next thing. She breathed the almost spring air into her lungs and let it sit there for a moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, where the coffee was warm and the list on the table was waiting, and the next item on it was already calling her name. The ground thawed slowly at first, in patches, the way winter always gives up ground, reluctantly and section by section, as though not quite ready to admit that a new season has rights here too. Clara watched it each morning from the yard, tracking the progress the way a person tracks something they have been waiting for a long time, without allowing themselves to wait impatiently. She had learned patience over the winter, not the passive, hopeful kind, but the active kind, the kind that does useful work while it waits. She had her seeds, she had her plan. She had her tools, some of them borrowed from Elliot and some purchased carefully from the farm supply store on the edge of town, where the man behind the counter had initially addressed himself to a spot somewhere over her shoulder, until she asked him a specific question about soil pH that he had not expected her to know to ask, and after that he had spoken to her directly, and without the condescension that sometimes accompanies the assumption that a woman new to farming must also be new to thinking. She had also been doing something she had not initially planned. She had been going to the County Agricultural Extension Office, a low building on the south edge of town staffed by people who had made it their professional purpose to help farmers understand their land. She had started going out of curiosity, pulled in by a notice in the county newsletter about a series of Saturday workshops on beginning farm management. The first session had been about soil health, and she had arrived early and sat in the front row and taken notes the way she had taken notes in school, thoroughly and with the understanding that she would be reviewing them later. The woman who ran the extension office was named Carol, and she was somewhere in her 50s, with the practical, unhurried manner of someone who has spent decades helping people who do not know where to start, find a place to begin. Carol did not treat inexperience as a failing. She treated it as a starting point, which was exactly what it was, and Clara appreciated this very much. At the second workshop, Clara sat beside a man named Owen, who farmed 30 acres about 12 miles north of her property. Owen was in his late 40s, recently divorced like her, and had inherited land he was trying to figure out after a career spent in an office. He asked her, during a break, if she was from the area originally. She said no. He said him neither, originally. They had coffee from a bad machine in the hallway and talked about the challenges of learning to work land without having grown up doing it, and she found the conversation easy in the way that conversations are easy when the other person is genuinely honest about what they do not know. Owen became something between an acquaintance and a friend over the following weeks. They attended the remaining workshops together and occasionally shared notes and sometimes called each other when they ran into problems that felt too small to bring to Carol, but too puzzling to leave alone. He was good company, and his situation was similar enough to hers that they could speak plainly about things that they might have dressed up differently for people who had more conventional lives. She did not think of Owen as anything more than a friend, and he seemed to feel the same way, and this was comfortable and clear and required no managing, which she appreciated. She had no space in her life for complication. She had fields to prepare. The first thing she planted was not the kitchen garden as she had planned. It was something smaller, a row of seeds in a tray on the south-facing kitchen windowsill, started indoors in early March to give them a head start before the outside soil was ready. Tomatoes from seed, which she had read required a long indoor start. She filled the small seed trays with a starting mix she had bought from the extension office supply, pressed the seeds in with her fingertip at the depth the packet specified, covered the trays with plastic to hold the moisture, and set them on the windowsill where the afternoon sun was strongest. Then she waited. On the fourth day she saw it, a tiny pale green curl pushing up through the soil in one of the trays. She stood at the windowsill and looked at it for a long time. It was barely larger than an eyelash. It was, in its way, extraordinary. She told Elliot about it when he came by that week, and he nodded with the satisfaction of someone who already knew this moment would come but is glad that you are experiencing it yourself. He said the first seedling always felt like something. He said you never quite got over it, no matter how many seasons you had seen. She understood what he meant. By early April, the kitchen garden plot was ready. She had prepared it through March, working the soil on the days when it was soft enough to turn, adding the compost she had been building since the previous fall from kitchen scraps and barn material, working it in with the attention to detail that Elliot had shown her was not fussiness, but the specific care that makes the difference between soil that produces and soil that merely sits there. She planted on a Thursday morning when the forecast was clear and the soil temperature, which she checked with a thermometer she had bought for the purpose, was just above the minimum for tomatoes. She knelt in the dirt and made the small holes and lowered in the seedlings she had started on the windowsill, which were now several inches tall and sturdier than she had expected, and she firmed the soil around each one with both hands. She planted the herbs beside them, basil and parsley and rosemary, each in its designated section. She planted the zucchini at the far end of the plot, where Elliot had said to put the things that spread, and along the fence at the back of the plot she pressed in the sunflower seeds, one by one, at the spacing the packet recommended, and then she stood up and dusted the soil from her knees and looked at what she had done. There was not much to see yet. The seedlings were small and the rows were modest and the fence behind them was still in need of paint, but it was real. She had put living things into the ground with her own hands, and now they would either grow or they would not. And if they did not, she would learn from the failure and try again, and if they did, she would understand something new. She watered everything carefully, and then went inside, and made tea, and sat at the kitchen table, not with her notepad, and not with a book, but simply sitting, looking out the window at the garden, at the small green things she had planted. Pepper came and sat beside her chair, and she put her hand on his head, and they sat there together in the quiet morning while the sun moved across the yard and the garden held its new things in the warming earth. That same week, she fixed the north fence. This was a larger job than the garden and a more purely practical one, without the emotional weight of growing something for the first time. She had the materials, purchased and stacked near the barn since February. She had watched 2 videos about fence post installation, paying particular attention to the part about setting the posts in concrete rather than simply tamping the soil, because she intended for this fence to stay up for many years, and she was not interested in doing the same job twice. She started early on a Saturday and worked through most of the day, digging the post holes with a rented post hole digger that was more demanding than the videos had suggested, because the soil near the north boundary was heavy with clay and required serious effort to penetrate. By noon she was perspiring in spite of the April cool, and her shoulders were talking to her in a language she had not been spoken to in before, a kind of deep, physical vocabulary that came from using muscles in exactly the way they were designed to be used but not yet accustomed to. She kept going. She set the posts. She mixed the concrete in the wheelbarrow she had found in the barn and cleaned up and decided was too useful to discard. She made sure each post was level before the concrete set. She ran the wire and attached it to the posts and made sure it was taut. When the last section was done and she stepped back to look at the whole line, the fence was straight and solid, and it was hers, made by her hands over the course of a long, hard, satisfying day. She ached for 3 days afterward. She did not mind. The bookkeeping job at Patricia's office had expanded slightly. Patricia had asked, in February, whether Clara would be willing to take on one additional client account, a small landscaping company in the county whose financial records were in considerable disorder. Clara had agreed, because the additional income was useful and because working through the disorder of someone else's accounts was genuinely interesting to her. The puzzle of it, the satisfaction of making something chaotic into something organized. Patricia had also, in that conversation, mentioned that she was thinking about her retirement in the next few years, and that when that time came she would need to think about what happened to the business. She did not make any direct offer. She was only thinking out loud, she said. But she had mentioned it to Clara specifically, which meant something. Clara had filed that conversation in her mind alongside the other information she was collecting about her future. The future that was taking shape differently than she had ever expected it to take shape, in a direction she would not have chosen and could not have planned, but which was, she was beginning to see, more fully hers than anything had been before. She was growing things, she was fixing things, she was learning the language of the land and the language of her own capability, and both of them were richer and more interesting than she had known. One evening in late April, she walked out to the kitchen garden just before the light went and stood looking at it. The tomatoes were reaching upward, several inches taller than when she had planted them. The herbs were bushing out in their sections, and along the back fence a row of small green spears had appeared where she had pressed in the sunflower seeds, each one pushing up through the soil with the absolute confidence of something that knows it belongs here and is simply doing what it came to do. She looked at them for a long time. She had put them there, her hands had pressed those seeds into that soil, and they had done what seeds do, which is to trust the earth and grow. She walked back to the house in the last of the light, and the evening was warm and the air was full of growing things, and for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, the future did not feel like something to be gotten through. It felt like something to move toward. She went inside. She fed Pepper. She made dinner. She sat at the kitchen table with the window open and the smells of spring coming through it. And she did not pick up her notepad or her book. She just sat in the quiet of the house that was hers, and the life that was hers, and let the evening settle around her like something earned. The tomatoes came in during a week of steady July heat that turned the mornings golden and the afternoons into something that required serious shade and cold water. Clara had not expected so many. She had planted 12 plants, following the spacing Elliot recommended, and she had tended them through May and June with what she now understood to be appropriate attention, not too much water, the right stakes, the pinching of the side shoots that Elliot had taught her to remove with a motion so casual he had done it without looking, and the tomatoes had responded with an enthusiasm that surprised her completely. She stood in the garden on a Tuesday morning with a basket that was already full, and looked at the vines and counted what remained, and then went inside and got a second basket. She ate tomatoes every day. She made sauce and jarred it, following a recipe from a preservation guide she had borrowed from the library, understanding for the first time why people who grew their own food spoke about it with a particular kind of intensity that she had previously found slightly excessive. The sauce she made from those tomatoes in that first summer was so much better than anything she had tasted from a jar that she stood at the stove eating it with a spoon directly from the pot and felt slightly astonished. She brought tomatoes to Patricia at the office, a bag of the mixed varieties she had grown, some deep red, some a golden yellow that she had included on a small impulse in the spring ordering and been glad of. Patricia lined them up on her desk and looked at them and said she had never grown anything in her life, and these were beautiful. She asked if Clara had done this by herself. Clara said mostly, with guidance from a neighbor. Patricia looked at her and shook her head slowly and said something under her breath that sounded like, well then. She brought some to Elliot, which felt somewhat like bringing coal to a coal mine, but Elliot accepted them graciously and said the yellow ones were a good choice, that he had grown them years ago and had forgotten how good they were. He said she had done a fine job with the garden. He said it the way he said most things, simply and without embellishment, which meant it landed with more weight than a more elaborate compliment would have. The zucchini had done what zucchini does, which is to produce an extraordinary volume with very little encouragement. She had eaten it prepared in every way she could think of, and she had brought it to the Saturday market in town where she had been selling eggs since the spring. The eggs had become a small but reliable income. She had 20 hens now, up from the original 8 she had inherited with the farm, having bought 12 more in March from a woman who was reducing her flock. The hens were opinionated and loud, and she liked them considerably more than she had expected to. The Saturday market was where things had begun to open up in a way she had not anticipated. She had started going simply to sell eggs, standing behind her small folding table with a handwritten sign and her cooler of cartons. And the people who stopped had been polite, and some of them had been interesting, and gradually she had begun to recognize faces, and faces had begun to recognize her. The woman named Deja, who sold handmade soap from the table beside her, had introduced herself the second week with the directness of someone who has decided that life is too short for the slow accumulation of acquaintance. She had red hair and strong opinions about everything, and an interest in people that made you feel, when she was talking to you, that you were the most interesting person currently available to be talked to. Clara liked her immediately, and was slightly startled by how much she liked her, having grown so accustomed to doing without easy company. Deja invited her to lunch on the third Saturday, with the casual certainty of someone who does not expect to be refused. Clara almost found a reason to say no, out of the old habit of keeping herself small and self-contained, and then she recognized what she was doing and said yes. They went to the diner across the square from the market and sat in a booth and talked for 2 hours. Deja asked questions with genuine curiosity, and listened to the answers with the same quality. She was a former graphic designer who had left a city agency job 4 years ago to make soap and sell it at markets and live on what that brought in, and she had a clear-eyed, practical relationship with the choice she had made that Clara found very recognizable. 2 women who had chosen the harder thing and were living it without apology. Clara told her, that afternoon, more than she had told most people about the farm and about what the year had been like. Not everything, but the shape of it. Deja listened without inserting her own reactions at every pause, a quality in a listener that Clara had come to value highly. At the end of what Clara had said, Deja was quiet for a moment, and then she said that it sounded like the most useful year she had ever had, even if it was not the year she would have chosen. Clara thought about that on the drive home. She thought that Deja had said something true that she herself had been circling around without quite saying. It was not the year she would have chosen, but it was the year she had gotten, and she had not wasted it, and that was something she could respect about herself. The sunflowers along the back fence had grown to heights that seemed almost theatrical, tall and heavy-headed, leaning slightly south toward the light. She had planted them for no reason other than that she wanted them, and they had delivered on that want with such abundance that she now cut them for the house every few days, and still had more than enough remaining on the fence. The kitchen table had sunflowers on it most of August. The front porch had them. She brought some to the market, and a woman with a young daughter bought 3 stems, and the girl held them with both hands, and looked at them with the expression of someone encountering something magnificent, and Clara felt something warm and uncomplicated pass through her at the sight. She had started, that summer, to think about what the farm might become in a larger sense, not just a place where she survived, but a place with a purpose. The slow weekends that she would eventually organize had not yet taken their final shape in her mind, but the seed of the idea was there, planted by something Deja had said at their second lunch, about how many people she knew in the city who were desperate for a reason to do something real with their hands. Clara had listened to that observation and filed it. She had too much to manage in the present to plan very far into the future, but she was a person who knew when an idea was worth keeping, and she kept it. The farm in summer was demanding in a different way than the farm in winter. The winter had been about endurance and containment, about keeping things from getting worse. The summer was about growth and maintenance and attention, about things happening very fast that required being watched. She was outside more than she was inside, and she came in at the end of each day with the specific, honest fatigue of physical work, different from the gray tiredness she had sometimes felt in her previous life, where the exhaustion had no clear origin and therefore no clear cure. This tiredness had a source. She had made it. She went to bed early and slept fully, which she had not reliably done in years. Owen came by one Saturday in July to see the garden. He was making progress on his own land and was curious about what a first kitchen garden looked like in full production. She walked him through it and he asked good questions, and they stood for a while in the afternoon heat talking about what they had each learned that season, what had worked and what they would do differently, with the particular pleasure of people who have discovered a shared vocabulary. He noticed the sunflowers and said they were something. She said she had planted them for no reason except that she wanted them. He looked at her for a moment and then said that was the best reason. She agreed. She was making money from the eggs and from the bookkeeping work, and the money was covering what she needed to cover with a small margin that she put aside each month without touching. She was not building anything yet, not in a financial sense, but she was stable, and stability was what she had needed more than anything else this year. To stand on ground that did not shift, To know that next month would look essentially like this month, reliable and real. There were still hard days. Days when the isolation of the farm felt less like peace and more like emptiness. Days when a problem arose that she did not immediately know how to solve, and she had to sit with the not knowing for longer than was comfortable. Days when she was tired in a way that made even the things she loved feel effortful. She did not pretend those days did not happen. She moved through them the way she moved through everything, one step and then the next, without the expectation that every day would feel like a good day. But there were also mornings like the one in late August when she woke before the alarm and lay still for a moment listening to the farm settle around her, the chickens already audible from the yard, the sound of wind in the trees at the east edge of the property, and felt something that she sat with for a while because she wanted to identify it accurately. She decided that it was contentment, not happiness exactly, which was a larger and less reliable thing, but contentment, which was the feeling of being in the right place, doing the right work, and having enough. She had not felt it consistently in many years, possibly not since before the marriage started to become what it became. And here it was, not dramatic, not announced, just present in an ordinary morning. She got up, she made coffee, she went outside in the early light and stood in the yard and looked at the farm, all its ongoing imperfection, and all its ongoing life, and felt the quiet, undemonstrative gladness of a person who has earned their place through honest effort, and knows it. The sunflowers along the fence were still standing, taller now, and some of them beginning to turn their heavy heads as August moved toward September. She walked over to them and looked at the line of them, all those tall, confident plants that had come from seeds she had pressed into the earth because she wanted them. That was still, she thought, the best reason. She went back inside. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and she was grateful for it, and she went to it. The autumn of that year felt different from the autumn before it. A year earlier, Clara had stood at the kitchen window and watched Raymond's truck disappear, and the season had been colored by the shock of that disappearance. This autumn arrived into a life that was in motion. She was not standing at a window watching something leave. She was outside, moving. She put up a second batch of preserves, this time expanding beyond tomato sauce to include a blueberry jam made from fruit she had picked herself at a farm stand up the county road, and a pickled zucchini that had been Deja's suggestion and turned out to be remarkable. The pantry shelves were filling. She looked at them with a satisfaction that had something almost ancestral about it, the particular pleasure of seeing food you have put by for the winter, the concrete knowledge that you are prepared. She had started keeping a farm journal. It had begun as a practical record, planting dates, what worked, what failed, weather patterns, costs, and it remained that, but it had also become something else over time. She wrote in it each evening, not much, half a page or less, just enough to mark the day and what it had held. She was aware that she was doing something useful for future planting seasons, tracking patterns, noting what the land did at each point of the year. But she was also aware that the journal was helping her see that she was living a life, that the days were adding up into something, that she was not simply enduring time but filling it with things that had her name on them. The slow weekends had begun to take a clearer shape in her mind. She had talked to Deja about it over several lunches through the summer and fall, thinking out loud the way you do when you have an idea that is not yet fully formed and needs the company of another intelligent person's reactions to become real. Deja was an excellent thinking partner because she asked clarifying questions without steering, and because she had practical experience with the economics of small creative businesses that Clara did not have. The basic shape of it was simple. She would invite small groups, no more than 8 at a time, to spend a weekend at the farm. They would do real things. They would gather eggs in the morning. They would work in the garden. They would learn to bake bread with proper technique, the kind that required time and attention, and produce something you could hold in your hands. They would eat dinner together around the long table in the farmhouse kitchen. They would sit around a fire in the evenings. They would sleep in the rooms she would prepare for them, the back bedrooms that she had been gradually making habitable over the year. She would charge a fair price. Not a luxury price, because she was not offering luxury. She was offering something else, the chance to do something real, to slow down for 48 hours, and be in a place where the things that mattered were simple and concrete. She believed there was an appetite for that. She had seen it in the faces of the people who stopped at her market table, and asked about the eggs and the tomatoes, and stayed talking longer than they had meant to. There was a hunger in people for something they could not easily name, and she thought she might have a small piece of the answer. She did not rush it. She was learning that good things take the time they take, and that the instinct to hurry a good idea into existence before it is ready usually produced something that was merely a faster version of the right thing rather than the right thing itself. What she did that autumn was prepare. She repainted the 2 guest bedrooms. She found, at an estate sale in October, 2 iron bed frames that were old and solid and beautiful in the plain way of things made to be used, and she had them delivered and set them up with good mattresses and simple white bedding. She refinished the floors in those rooms herself, a project that took 2 weekends and required renting equipment and learning a new skill. But the result was floors that glowed warmly in the afternoon light and made the rooms feel, as she stood in the doorways looking in, like rooms someone would want to be in. She framed some photographs she had taken over the summer and hung them in the hallway outside the guest rooms, the sunflowers, the tomatoes in their rows. A photograph she had taken of Pepper standing at the edge of the east field in morning light, looking into the middle distance with the thoughtful expression he sometimes wore. The photographs were not technically sophisticated, but they were honest, and they looked right on those walls. The farm itself was beginning to feel different from the outside, too. The fence lines were straight now. The barn door hung correctly. The kitchen garden had been cleared for winter with the attention of someone who understood that what you do in autumn determines what spring can begin with. She had mulched the perennial herbs for protection and drawn back the annual beds and dug in compost along every row. Elliot came by one morning in October and walked the property with her as he sometimes did, companionable and unhurried. He looked at everything carefully, as he always did, and when they got back to the house he stood in the yard for a moment and looked back at it from the outside and said, without particular emphasis, that it was looking well cared for. Clara looked at the house from the same angle. She tried to see it as someone coming for the first time would see it. The new shingles had weathered to match the old ones now. The shutters had been painted, a deep blue-green that she had chosen after considering many colors and then going with the one that looked right to her eye without any further justification. The porch had its rocking chair, the one she had built herself from a kit over 2 winter weekends, sanded smooth and treated with a finish that would hold up to seasons. The lavender she had planted along the steps in the spring had not yet grown into itself fully, but it was alive, and it was there. It was looking well cared for. She agreed with Elliot, and she let the agreement sit in her without immediately moving to the next thing. In November, Louise, from Patricia's office, mentioned that her cousin lived in the city and had been looking for exactly the kind of experience Clara was planning to offer. Clara found herself describing the slow weekends in more detail than she had intended, and Louise listened with the kind of attention that meant she was going to do something with what she was hearing. 2 weeks later, Louise's cousin called. Her name was Vera, and she was asking, carefully and a little hopefully, whether it would be possible to book a weekend for herself and a small group of friends in the spring. Clara held the phone and looked out the kitchen window at the yard and the garden and the barn and the fence that she had fixed with her own hands, and she said yes. She said yes, and she meant it, and when she hung up the phone she stood very still for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen while the full weight of what that yes meant settled over her. Not just the income, though the income mattered and she had already worked out that a few weekends each season would make a real difference to her position, but what it meant beyond the income, what it meant that someone who did not know her had heard what she was building and wanted to come and be part of it. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the kitchen table and looked at them. These hands had fixed fences and planted gardens and replastered walls and split wood and kneaded bread dough and driven a tractor and turned the pages of books she had never expected to read. They had built a rocking chair. They had pressed sunflower seeds into the earth. She thought about the kitchen table of a year ago, and the note in the envelope, and the cold coffee, and the stillness. She thought about Helen walking the property with the eyes of a calculator. She thought about Elliot handing over a jar of honey at the back door. She thought about the ice storm and the 4 nights on the couch in the winter that had tried its hardest and not broken her. She thought about Pepper asleep in the corner with his heavy, faithful presence, and the tomatoes that had come in all at once in July, and the sound the tractor made when Dennis got it running properly, and the first seedling that appeared on the windowsill in March like a small green declaration. She had done all of it, every piece of it, not because she had known how at the outset, but because she had decided to stay, and because staying had required learning, and because she had been willing to learn. She looked out the window at the farm in its November quiet, the fields turned over, the garden beds mulched, the barn door straight on its hinge, the sunflowers long gone but the fence they had grown against standing clean and solid. She looked at all of it, and she felt the deep, honest satisfaction of someone who has built something real. Vera and her friends would come in the spring, and there would be others after them, and the east field would be planted again, and the pantry would fill and be emptied and fill again through the turning of seasons, and the rocking chair on the porch would be sat in, by her and by others, and the kitchen table would hold conversations that had not yet happened. She was not done. She knew that. She had a long way still to go and much still to learn, and many seasons still ahead of her with their difficulties and their rewards and their days that would be hard, and their mornings that would make everything worth it. But she had begun. And the beginning, real and solid and entirely hers, was already more than she had thought possible when she had stood at the window with cold coffee in her hands and watched the dust settle on an empty road. She was still here. She had always been here. And the farm, the rundown, imperfect, beautiful, demanding farm that a man had signed over and walked away from, was alive. She was alive too, more than she had been in years, more honestly and fully and without apology than she could remember being. She got up from the kitchen table and filled the kettle for tea. Outside, the November light was thin but present, falling across the yard and the garden beds and the fence line and the fields, touching everything it reached with a quiet, even attention, finding nothing here that did not belong. The first snow of December came early that year, falling in the night without announcement, and Clara woke to the kind of silence that only snow creates, a thick, soft blanketing of the world's usual noise. She lay still for a moment before getting up, listening to it without opening her eyes, and thought that there was something she genuinely loved about that silence. It was the silence of a world that had slowed itself down. She could feel it even through the walls. She had come a long way from the woman who had been frightened by the winter before this one. Last year, her first winter alone on the farm, she had faced the cold with the wariness of someone encountering an opponent. She had prepared carefully, and the preparation had paid off. But there had been an edge of anxiety beneath every decision she made in those months. The anxiety of someone who is not yet sure they know what they are doing. This year was different. She knew what she was doing, not everything. She was still learning, and would continue learning for as long as she farmed this land, but she knew enough. She knew how the house behaved in cold, which walls were vulnerable, which pipes required attention, where the warmth collected and where it did not. She knew where to stack the wood for the most efficient access. She knew how the chickens needed their coop managed in freezing temperatures. She knew, in her body, and not just in her mind, what the farm needed from her when the cold arrived. She got up and dressed in her layers and went downstairs and made coffee, and then went to the window and looked out at the white yard and the snow-covered garden beds and the barn wearing its cap of snow, and felt the particular pleasure of a person who is exactly where they have chosen to be. Patricia had made her offer in November, not formally, not yet, but in the way that serious people make serious suggestions when the time is approaching but not quite arrived. She had said over one of their office lunches that she was thinking about the future of the practice, and that she wanted Clara to know that when she was ready to have that conversation, she would like to have it with her. Clara had said she would like that too, and they had left it there, both understanding that the conversation was waiting, and neither rushing it. The idea of eventually owning the accounting practice, even partly, was something Clara turned over in her mind during the quiet winter evenings. It was not a dream she had ever had for herself. She had never imagined herself as a business owner of any kind. But she had learned, this year, that what she could imagine for herself had very little relationship to what she was actually capable of. She had expanded enormously this year, in ways she could not have foreseen, and the expansion had not felt like reaching beyond herself but like coming back to herself. Like discovering that the self she had been politely managing down for years was actually considerably larger than the space she had been trying to fit it into. She could own a business. She could run a farm. She could do both. She could, she was beginning to understand, do quite a lot, if she simply kept getting up in the morning and doing the next thing. Louise had helped her put together a simple leaflet for the slow weekends. Nothing elaborate, a clean description of what the experience offered, with the photographs she had taken over the summer, printed small and clear on good paper. Deja had looked at it and made 2 suggestions, and the second version was better. Clara had sent it, along with a personal note, to 6 people she had met over the year who she thought might be interested, or might know someone who was. She was not in a hurry. Vera and her group were booked for April. That was enough to start with. She had also, in October, put up a small sign at the bottom of the farm driveway. Not a large one, just a neatly painted board with the name she had decided on for the farm. She had not used Raymond's family name for it, which was what it had always been called, but her own name. She had thought about this for weeks and then made the decision cleanly. She had replaced what he had left behind with what she had built. The name should reflect that. She had painted the sign herself. She had dug the post and set it in concrete the way she had learned to set fence posts. She had put it up on a dry Tuesday morning in October, and then walked back to the house and turned around and looked at it from the driveway, and felt a satisfaction that was very quiet and very complete. The farm had a new name now. It was hers. Owen came by on a Saturday morning in December, not long after the snow, and they walked the property together in the winter quiet, leaving footprints in the white. He had had a difficult season in some ways. His first attempt at a proper cash crop had not gone as planned, and he was reconsidering his approach for the following year. Clara listened carefully and offered what thoughts she had. which were not many but were honest, and she noticed that he listened to them with the same attention she gave to Elliot's guidance. They had become genuinely useful to each other over the course of the year. Two people learning the same difficult thing at the same time in neighboring places, able to compare notes without competition. They had tea in the kitchen afterward, and she showed him the guest room she had prepared, and he stood in the doorway of the first one and looked at the iron bed with its white linens, and the photographs on the wall and the glowing floor, and said it was really something. She asked what he meant. He said he meant that it looked like a place a person would want to come to. He said she had made it feel like somewhere, not just a room, but somewhere. She thought about that later, after he had gone. Somewhere. She had made this place into somewhere. A place that had presence and intention, that had been shaped by the specific person who lived in it, and the choices that person had made, one after another, across 4 seasons. She had done that. There was no other explanation, and she did not need one. Christmas came, and she spent it with Helen's family, driving up to the town she had grown up in and sitting at Helen's kitchen table with Helen's husband and their 2 children, and their noise and their warmth and their willingness to pull her into the center of the gathering, rather than leave her at the edge of it. She was glad to be there. She was also glad, on the drive back through the winter dark, to be heading home. Both things were true simultaneously, which seemed to her a healthy sign. She arrived back at the farm in the late evening, and the house was dark, but it was not empty. It was waiting for her. She unlocked the back door, and Pepper met her in the hallway with his tail moving steadily, and she bent and pressed her face against the warm fur of his neck for a moment. Then she straightened up and took off her coat and put on the kettle, and turned on the lights, and the kitchen came alive around her, warm and familiar, and entirely hers. She stood in the kitchen for a moment before taking off her boots. She looked at the room, the table with its single sunflower she had dried and placed in a jar, the shelves of preserved goods in their neat rows, the cookbooks on their shelf, the notepad with tomorrow's list already begun. She looked at all of it and felt the same quiet, solid thing she had been feeling more and more over the course of this year. The thing that was not dramatic but was real. The sense of having arrived somewhere that she had not known she was looking for. She made her tea. She sat down. She picked up her farm journal and wrote the date at the top of the page and then sat for a moment thinking about what to write. She wrote that this had been the hardest year of her life, and also, without question, the most important. She wrote that she had learned more about soil and fences and roofing and pipe insulation and chicken management and bread baking and seed timing than she had known existed to be learned. She wrote that she had fixed things with her own hands that she had not known she could fix, and built things she had not known she could build, and survived a winter she had not known she could survive. She wrote about Elliot and Patricia and Deja and Owen and Louise and Vera and all the people who had entered her life through the door that had been opened when Raymond walked out. She wrote about Pepper and the sunflowers and the tomatoes and the first seedling on the windowsill. She wrote that she was still here, that she had chosen to stay, and the staying had been the right choice, and she knew it in a way that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone and everything to do with the life she was now living, which was real and hers and growing. She sat with the journal open on the table for a while after she finished writing, and the house settled around her in its winter quiet, and outside the snow was blue in the moonlight, and the farm was still, and the east field waited, as it always waited, for spring. January of the second year arrived, carrying the same cold as the first, but it landed differently. Clara moved through it with a competence she recognized in herself, without self-congratulation. The quiet, undramatic competence of someone who has done this before and knows how. She checked the pipes. She split the wood. She tended the animals with the efficiency of established routine and the attention of someone who cares about them. She also spent more of January indoors than she had the previous year, deliberately and without guilt. She had earned the slower pace of a cold month, and she used it productively in a different way, reading and planning and working on the materials for the slow weekends, which were going to begin in earnest in the spring. She wanted everything to be thought through before Vera and her group arrived in April. Not overplanned. She had learned enough to know that rigid planning in a farm setting was its own kind of problem, but thoughtfully prepared, so that the experience she offered was coherent and genuine, and did what she intended it to do. She had thought about what she wanted people to feel when they left, not what she wanted to show them or teach them, though those things mattered, but what she wanted them to feel. She wanted them to feel that they had been somewhere real. She wanted them to leave with a sense, however small, that there was another way to spend time, another way to be in the world. She wanted them to have made something with their hands, bread or garden work or a repaired fence rail or a jar of something preserved. She wanted them to sit at the long kitchen table and eat food that had come from the ground around them, and feel the particular quiet satisfaction of that. She wrote all of this down in her journal, and then in a more organized form, in a notebook she had designated for the slow weekend specifically. She wrote the schedule for a typical weekend, hour by hour, with enough flexibility built in that it would not feel like a program but enough structure that it would not feel loose. She wrote about what she would cook and where the ingredients would come from, and how she would handle the difference between people who were capable and willing, and people who were nervous about doing things they had never done. She had been nervous about things she had never done. She knew how to work with that. Deja had agreed to come and lead a session on the second slow weekend of the season, a practical morning on making things by hand that would complement Clara's morning in the kitchen. They had worked out a fair arrangement, and the prospect of Deja's presence on those weekends was one Clara looked forward to in a way that felt simple and good. Deja brought energy that was different from her own, bright and extroverted where Clara was quieter and more deliberate, and the combination would be better than either of them alone. Owen had mentioned that he might be interested in participating in some capacity the following year, if the project proved itself this season. She had not made any promises, but she had said she would think about it, and she was thinking about it. The slow weekends could grow in different directions depending on how they went, and she did not want to define the shape before she had seen what it was becoming. February brought something she had not expected. She received a letter, an actual paper letter, handwritten, in an envelope addressed to the farm in handwriting she recognized immediately. She held it in both hands for a moment in the entryway before opening it, feeling its weight, which was slight, and deciding what she felt about receiving it, which was less than she might have expected. It was from Raymond. He was living in the city now, he wrote, working in a logistics company, doing all right. He asked how she was. He said he had heard, from someone he would not name, that she was doing something interesting with the farm. He said he was glad if that was true. He said he hoped she did not mind him writing. He said he was sorry for the way things had ended, that he knew he had not handled it well, that there were things he should have said differently and things he should not have said at all. He said he had been thinking about that. He did not ask to come back. The letter did not contain anything that asked for anything. It was only a man who had made a choice and was living with it, and who had reached a point where he felt he needed to say a small portion of the things he had not said when he left. Clara sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. Then she put it down and made herself a cup of tea and sat with it for a while, not reading the letter again but sitting with the fact of its existence. She thought about what response she wanted to make, and then she thought more carefully about what she actually felt, underneath the first layer of response. She was not angry. She had worked through most of her anger in the winter months of the first year, in the long dark evenings when feelings had space to move through her without being suppressed or performed. What remained was something more complicated than anger, and also more manageable. A clear-eyed understanding of what had happened and what it had cost her and what it had, in a way she had not chosen, also given her. She wrote back. She wrote a brief letter, shorter than his, because she had less to say, or perhaps because what she had to say required fewer words. She said she was well. She said the farm was doing well. She said she bore him no ill will and that she hoped his life in the city was what he had needed it to be. She said that she was glad to know he was doing all right. She did not say anything more personal than that, because there was nothing more personal that she wanted to say. She sealed the envelope and put it on the hall table to mail, and then went back to her day, which had a full list of items and did not need to be interrupted further by the past. The letter went in the mail the following morning when she drove into town. She did not think about it again in any significant way. What she thought about, that February and into March as the days lengthened almost imperceptibly toward spring, was the East Field. She was going to expand this year, carefully and within her means, but expand. She had talked to Elliot about what was realistic, and she had done her own research and her own calculations, and she had arrived at a plan that was ambitious without being reckless. She would plant a larger vegetable garden, sufficient to supply the slow weekends with produce through the summer and autumn. She would plant a section of cut flowers, not many, but enough to have fresh flowers in the house and for the guest rooms through the growing season, and she would dedicate a small section of the East Field to herbs grown for drying, which Deja had expressed interest in incorporating into her soap making. She ordered seeds in early February and laid them out on the kitchen table and organized them by planting time. The order was larger than last year's, and the planning behind it was more careful, informed by a full season of experience. She knew now what she would not have known before, what the soil in different sections of the property responded to, how the light moved across the garden through the growing months, which plants had done well without much attention and which had required constant vigilance, what she had wanted more of, and what she had planted too ambitiously. She was a farmer now, not in the way Elliot was a farmer, not yet, not with 50 years behind her in this soil, but genuinely and without qualification. This was what she did. This land was what she knew. March arrived with mud and possibility, as it always did. The ground was still cold enough that she could not plant outdoors, but the trays on the windowsill were already starting, more of them this year and more organized, each one labeled with what it held and when it was started, so that the record she was building would make next year easier, and the year after that easier still. She was building something that would compound, like the soil itself, getting richer and more capable with each season. She felt the truth of that in a way that was not abstract but entirely real. The farm she would manage in 5 years would be the product of the decisions she was making now, the same way the farm she had now was the product of the decisions she had made in that first, difficult year. Everything she did compounded forward. She thought about that on a March morning when she was starting seeds at the kitchen table, pressing each tiny thing into its section of soil, and the window beside her was showing the first real warmth of the approaching season, the light changing its quality, the air smelling different through the inch she had opened the window. And she thought about the woman at this same table a year ago who had no idea what she was capable of and had decided to try anyway. She was grateful to that woman. She was that woman, and she was grateful to her. April came with its complicated beauty, warm days and cold nights, mud that had character and air that smelled of things beginning. Vera and her group arrived on a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of the month, driving in 2 cars up the dirt road that was no longer particularly associated with loss in Clara's mind, but had become simply the road that led home. There were 7 of them, Vera and 6 friends, ranging in age from their late 20s to their mid-50s, all of them from the city, all of them carrying that particular combination of eagerness and self-consciousness that people bring to experiences they want very much but are not sure they are going to be good at. Clara recognized it because she had worn it herself for most of the previous year. She was neither patronizing nor dismissive about it. She simply welcomed them the way she welcomed everything now, with practical warmth and a clear idea of what came next. She had made a simple dinner for that first evening, a lamb stew that had been cooking most of the afternoon, filling the house with a smell that was exactly right for an April evening in a farmhouse. There was bread, made that morning, and salad from the first small things that had appeared in the cold frame she had built along the south wall of the house through the winter. There was something to drink. There were candles on the long table, because candles on a table in the evening were one of the simplest pleasures available to people, and she saw no reason not to provide them. They ate, and they talked. They asked her questions, some practical and some more personal, and she answered them all honestly, including the ones that required honesty about how the farm had come to her, which she described simply and without drama. She said she had inherited it from a situation that ended. She said it had needed a great deal of work. She said she had done the work. She did not need more detail than that, and they did not push for more detail, which told her something useful about them as a group. That first evening set a tone that held through the rest of the weekend. Nobody pretended to know more than they knew. Nobody competed. They were 7 people who had taken 2 days out of their ordinary lives to be somewhere real, and they were making the most of it with the goodwill of people who understand they are receiving something. Saturday morning began at 7 with the chickens. Clara took all 7 of them into the coop and showed them how to collect the eggs, and explained about the hens, their personalities and their habits, in the way that someone who has come to genuinely like their animals talks about them. 2 of the women in the group had never been inside an animal coop of any kind, and their faces when the chickens moved around them, unconcerned and purposeful, were a kind of uncomplicated delight that Clara found she loved to witness. After breakfast, they went to the kitchen garden and planted. The tomato seedlings were ready, the same process she had done alone the year before, and this time she did it with 7 other people, each of them kneeling in the dirt, making holes, lowering in the seedlings, firming the soil. A woman named Iris, who was in her mid-40s and had a very precise and exacting quality in ordinary conversation, turned out to be extraordinary in the garden, handling the seedlings with a care and a sureness that Clara noticed. She told Iris afterward that she had good hands for it. Iris looked at her own hands and then back at Clara and said she had never been told that about her hands before. Deja arrived late morning and set up her soap-making station at the long kitchen table, and the afternoon was full of the smell of botanical oils and the sound of Deja explaining things in her particular way, which made everything seem simultaneously serious and enjoyable. Clara made lunch and moved between the kitchen and the table, available but not hovering, and watched the group find the rhythm of a shared project. By Saturday evening, when they sat again at the long table for dinner, something had shifted in the group. The self-consciousness of Friday evening was gone. They were easier with each other and easier with themselves, the way people become when they have done real things with their hands and their bodies, and have found out that they were capable of it. The conversation at the table was different from the night before, not just more comfortable but more substantive, as though the day's work had lowered some guard and made room for the more interesting things. Clara sat at the head of the table and listened and contributed and felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, that this was exactly what she had hoped it would be. Not perfect. She could think of small things she would do differently next time. But right. It was doing what she had intended it to do. She was not wrong about what people needed. She was not wrong about what this place could offer. Around the fire that evening, after dinner, one of Vera's friends, a man named Roger who had said very little all weekend but had worked harder than anyone in the garden, said something that Clara thought about for a long time afterward. He said that he had forgotten what it felt like to do something where you could actually see the result. He said that most of his work life consisted of things that were invisible, decisions and processes that changed numbers on screens, and that he could not remember the last time he had held something he had made. He held up his hands, which still had a little soil under the fingernails, and looked at them in the firelight. Clara looked at his hands and thought about her own hands at the kitchen table in that first January, asking herself what she knew how to do. She thought about everything those hands had done in the months since then. She understood exactly what Roger meant. The group left Sunday afternoon with jars of the tomato sauce she had preserved in the summer and a small bundle of dried lavender from the previous year's plants, and a general air of people who have been somewhere they did not expect to be moved by, and have been moved anyway. Vera hugged her at the cars and said she was going to tell everyone she knew. Clara said she was glad they had come. She stood in the driveway and watched the cars go down the road, and then she turned and looked at the farm. The kitchen window was lit warm in the afternoon light. The chickens were moving in their yard. The garden beds held the seedlings from Saturday morning, each one in its proper place, tended and cared for. She had built something. Not just a structure, not just a working farm, but something that other people could come to and take something real away from. That was more than she had known she was building, even when she was building it. She went inside. Pepper met her at the door. She made tea and sat at the kitchen table and opened her farm journal and wrote about the weekend, everything that had worked and everything she would adjust, the small practical notes that would make the next one better. And then at the end, before she closed it, she wrote one more sentence. She wrote that she thought she had found what the farm was for. Summer returned with its heat and its abundance and its demands, and Clara moved through it as someone who has been through a full cycle of seasons on a piece of land moves through the returning ones, with the particular confidence of the familiar. She knew this heat now. She knew how the farm responded to it, how the garden needed water in the morning before the sun got high, how the chickens needed shade, and how the east field dried out along the south edge faster than elsewhere and needed attention. The slow weekends were full through July and August. She had 6 bookings over the 2 months, small groups of 4 to 8 people, different combinations of strangers and friends and couples and individuals, but with a similar quality in all of them. They arrived carrying the weight of their ordinary lives, and they left a little lighter. Clara noticed this consistently. The specific lightness that comes from a weekend of doing things with your hands, eating food that came out of the ground 50 yards from where you ate it, sleeping in a quiet house far from the noise of a city. She was not making a great deal of money from the slow weekends. The income was supplemental, and the costs of hosting were real, the food and the materials and the time. But the weekends were paying for themselves and producing a margin that she reinvested directly into the farm, into seeds and equipment and the ongoing repairs that a working farm always requires. And they were doing something else, something she had not fully anticipated, which was making the farm feel alive with purpose in a way that sustained her through the more difficult stretches of the work. Patricia had made her offer formally in June, in the office, over the lunch she had been saving it for. She proposed that Clara buy into the practice as a partner, with an agreement that allowed Clara to purchase Patricia's remaining share over the following 5 years at a fair price. The arrangement would give Clara part ownership immediately and full ownership eventually, and Patricia would stay involved in a reduced capacity for the transition period, which suited both of them. Clara had asked for a week to think about it. She had used that week carefully, doing the calculations Patricia had provided, asking a few questions to an accountant she trusted, talking to Helen once and to no one else. At the end of the week, she accepted. She signed the partnership agreement on a Tuesday morning, at the desk she had been sitting at for over a year, and Patricia poured 2 small glasses of very good sherry, from a bottle she had apparently been saving for precisely this occasion, and they sat in the afternoon light and drank it, not saying much, because the thing they had agreed on did not require much more to be said. Clara drove home that evening as a part owner of a business. She drove home to a farm that was producing food and hosting weekends and caring for 20 chickens and a dog and whatever was growing in the east field, which at that moment was tomatoes and herbs and cut flowers and a new small section of lavender that she had planted in spring, and which was beginning, slowly and with the deliberate pace of a perennial finding its footing, to establish itself. She was a farmer and a business owner, and a person who had, in the space of something less than 2 years, built an entirely different life from the pieces of one that had come apart. She had not planned it this way. She had not planned any of it. She had only decided, at the beginning, to stay, and then to learn, and then to keep doing the next right thing, and this was where it had led. Owen had a better season that year. He came by in late July with a bottle of wine to market, and they sat on the porch in the warm evening and talked about their respective patches of ground and what had worked and what had not. And she told him about the partnership with Patricia, and he said that was the best news he had heard all summer. She said she thought it was too. Elliot was slower that summer than he had been the year before. Not ill, just older, moving through his days at a pace that was more careful and less effortless. He still came by on Wednesday mornings and sat on the porch and drank coffee, and she was glad every time she heard his truck in the driveway. She had learned so much from him. She owed him a debt that could not be repaid in the ordinary way, only in the way of passing things forward, which she was already doing in her small way when she answered the questions that people brought to the slow weekends. She brought him tomatoes and herbs through the summer and occasionally made him dinner, which he accepted without fuss in the way he accepted everything. He told her once, eating soup at her kitchen table, that it was a pleasure to see this farm being used properly. He said it with his particular economy of expression. She understood what he meant, and it mattered to her very much. The cut flowers came in through July and August in a succession of blooms that she cut and arranged in vases throughout the house and the guest rooms, and brought to the market and to Patricia and to Deja, and occasionally simply left in large bunches on the kitchen table because they were beautiful and abundance should be enjoyed. The sunflowers came back, of course, because she planted them again along the same fence, the second row of them in the same soil where the first had grown, and they came up just as tall and just as unreasonably confident as the year before, and she was just as glad to see them. She thought about Roger's hands in the firelight. She thought about Iris discovering she had good hands for seedlings. She thought about the woman with the young daughter at the market, holding the cut stems with both hands, and the look on the little girl's face. Small moments, real ones. This was what she was making, alongside the tomatoes and the eggs and the preserved goods and the accounting work. She was making small, real moments for people, including herself. She had a harder week in August when she was simply exhausted, a combination of the heat and the pace and a minor cold she could not quite shake, and she spent 3 days moving through the work more slowly than usual and going to bed earlier than usual, and being gentler with herself than she might have been at the beginning of this journey. She was learning about that too, about the importance of not treating herself as someone who was not allowed to be tired, about the difference between giving up and knowing when to rest. They were not the same thing, and she had spent enough of her life confusing them. She rested, she recovered. She got up the following Monday and started the week and felt the return of her energy as a concrete physical fact, like a wind that had dropped and then picked up again. September brought cooler air and the beginning of the harvest, and she moved through it with the deep pleasure of someone bringing in what they have grown, spending days in the garden and the field with baskets and hands and the satisfaction of work that has come to its right conclusion. She put up more sauce. She dried herbs in the barn, hanging them in bundles from the rafters, where they filled the air with a smell that she now associated entirely with this place and this work and this life. She made jam. She pickled things. She pressed apple cider with a rented press from a man down the road who had an orchard, and let his neighbors use it in exchange for a case of whatever they produced. The pantry shelves were full again by October. She stood in front of them and looked at the rows of jars and felt what she had felt the first time she had begun to fill them, but stronger now. The pleasure of provision, the knowledge that she had grown and made and preserved all of this herself, with her own planning and her own labor and her own decisions made well enough that the result was abundance. She thought about the woman who had never gardened a day in her life and stood in the east field in August of her first summer and looked at 12 tomato plants producing more tomatoes than she knew what to do with and felt surprised. She thought about how far that woman was from where she was standing now. The distance was real. She had covered it with her own feet. The day Raymond came back down the road was a Tuesday in October of the second autumn. Clara was on the porch sanding the rocking chair she had built, not the first one. She had built that one the previous winter, but a second one she had made for the other side of the porch, wanting the symmetry, wanting 2 chairs instead of 1. She was sanding the arm of it with steady, even strokes, and the wood was warm in the afternoon sun, and the sound was quiet and repetitive and satisfying. She heard the truck before she saw it. The sound of an engine on the dirt road was something she had learned to distinguish from other sounds. Different vehicles had different qualities. This one was unfamiliar. She did not look up immediately. There were delivery trucks occasionally, and Elliot's visitors sometimes came down the wrong road. Then she looked up. She recognized the truck, older than she remembered it, a little more worn. Raymond parked at the foot of the porch steps and sat for a moment before getting out. She could see him through the windshield, and she let him have the moment. She had no urgency about any of this. When he got out and stood by the truck, he was thinner than he had been, and his face had something in it that had not been there before. A kind of settling, like a landscape after a long process is finished. He looked at her first, and then he looked at the farm, and she watched him look at it. She could see, through his eyes, what he was seeing. The 2 rocking chairs on the painted porch, the lavender border along the steps, not fully established yet but clearly intentional, clearly planted by someone who knew what they were doing and intended to watch it grow. The new shutters, the color she had chosen, the sign at the bottom of the driveway with the farm's new name on it, visible from where he stood. He looked at the barn, which had new boards on the east side where the old ones had failed. He looked at the fence line, which was straight and properly maintained. He looked at the garden beds, cleared for winter but with the clear structure of a garden that has been seriously tended. He looked at the farmhouse, which had new paint on the trim and straight gutters and a front door whose hardware she had replaced because the old set had never worked properly, and she had been meaning to fix it for years. He took a long time to look at all of it. Then he looked back at her. She had put down the sandpaper while he was looking. She was sitting in the chair she had been working on, not the finished one but the one in progress, and she was sitting in it with her hands in her lap, and she was not performing anything. She was not performing composure, she simply was composed. Because this moment, which she might have imagined as something large and charged, was not, in the event, that complicated. He came up the porch steps and she did not stand, and he sat on the steps rather than in the other chair, which she understood to be him reading the situation correctly. He said hello. She said hello. He said it looked incredible. She said thank you. He said he had heard she was doing something with the farm, with guests coming, with the market. He said he had heard from more than one person that it was something to see. She said it was coming along. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said what he had probably come to say. He said he had made a mistake. He said he knew that was not adequate, but he said it plainly and without decorating it. He said he had thought, when he left, that the thing he needed was elsewhere, and he had gone looking for it, and he had found out that what he had been looking for had been here all along, in the work of this land and the life of this place, and that he had left it before he understood what it was. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. She was very quiet when he finished. She had thought, over the preceding months, about what she might say if Raymond ever came back and said something like this. She had not spent very long thinking about it, because it was not a thought that called for much of her time, but she had thought about it enough to know what was true. She said she was glad he had come. She said she meant that. She said she did not hold anger toward him, and that was also true, because the anger had long since completed its purpose and been released. She said she believed that what he felt was genuine, and she did not question it. Then she said that there was no room here for him anymore. She said it without hardness. She said it the way she said things that were simply true. She said that what had been here when he left was not what was here now, and what was here now had been made in his absence and could not be unmade. She said she was a different person than she had been when he drove down this road the first time, and this place was a different place, and what she was building here was built on what she had become without him, and there was no way to unknow that and no reason to try. He sat on the steps and looked at his own hands for a while. Then he looked up at her and said he understood. His voice was very quiet. She said she hoped his life in the city was good. She said she meant that too. He nodded. He stayed for a few more minutes, not saying much, just sitting in the quiet of the farm in the afternoon air. She let him have that. She had no reason to take it from him. The farm was generous in that way, generous with its quiet, with its air, with the particular peace it offered to anyone who sat still in it long enough. When he stood up and said he should go, she stood too. He held out his hand and she shook it, and that was the right thing to do, the human and uncomplicated thing, and she felt no difficulty in doing it. She watched him walk to his truck and get in. She watched the truck turn in the yard and go back down the road. This time the dust it kicked up was thinner, maybe because the road had been graded recently, maybe because it was a different season, maybe because everything looks different the second time. The truck disappeared at the bend and was gone. She sat back down in the rocking chair she had been sanding. She picked up the sandpaper. She continued. The porch was quiet around her, and the afternoon was good, and the chair under her hands was taking its proper shape. The lavender along the steps smelled faintly of itself in the warm air. Behind her, through the front door, she could hear Pepper moving in the hallway, his claws on the refinished floor. She was full. That was the truest word for it. She was full in the way of a person who has done enough and built enough and become enough, that there is no corresponding empty space for what has just been offered. She was not untouched by what Raymond had said. She was not made of stone, but she was full, and when you are full there is simply nowhere for what does not belong to go. She sanded the arm of the chair until it was smooth. Then she moved to the leg and sanded that too, and the afternoon went on around her, warm and real and entirely sufficient. The slow weekends continued through the autumn, the last one in late October when the trees were at their deepest color, and the mornings had the edge of serious cold in them, and the light fell across the farm at that long autumn angle that made everything look significant. The guests that weekend were a mixed group, older than some of the summer groups, quieter, more inclined to sit on the porch in the mornings with their coffee and be still than to fill the silence with talk. Clara had learned that different groups needed different things, and this group needed quiet, and she gave it to them without making them feel that their quiet was unusual. They spent Saturday afternoon making soup from the last of the autumn garden, a long, slow process that Clara led with the ease of someone who has done it many times and loves it. They worked around the big kitchen table, chopping and stirring and tasting, and the house filled with the smell of it, and by the time the soup was done the evening had come in, and they sat at the table in candlelight, and ate what they had made together, and the conversation, when it came, was the best kind, the kind that happens naturally when people are warm and fed and in the right place. A woman named Frances, who was 62 and had retired from a teaching career the previous spring, said that weekend that she had forgotten what it felt like to make something. She said she had spent 30 years making things in a classroom, lessons and environments and moments of understanding for her students, and she had loved it, but when she retired she had lost track of where the making went. She said that the soup was a small thing, but it was a real thing, and she had made it with her hands, and that meant something. Clara thought about what Frances said for a long time afterward. She thought about all the people who had come through this farm over 2 seasons, and what they had said about what the experience gave them. She thought about Roger's hands in the firelight. She thought about Iris and her good hands for seedlings. She thought about Vera, who had sent a card after the first weekend that Clara had kept on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. She was giving people something. Not just an experience, but a reminder of something they already had and had lost track of. The capacity to make things, to fix things, to work with their hands in the soil or the kitchen or the barn, to be present in a place with purpose. She was giving them that reminder, and they were taking it home with them and doing something with it, because several of the people who had come had written to say as much. Vera had started a container garden on her city balcony. Roger had signed up for a woodworking class. Iris had gotten an allotment. The farm was not just a farm anymore. It was a starting point for things she would never fully know about, things growing out of it in directions she could not see. The way seeds carried on the wind land somewhere far from where they fell, and put down roots without anyone's knowledge. She liked that. She liked that the farm had effects beyond what she could measure. It seemed right to her that a place built with this much intention should have effects that went beyond the visible. November arrived and the last guests of the season departed, and the farm went quiet, with the particular quality of end-of-season quiet, not empty but resting. Clara moved into the winter preparation with the ease and the thoroughness of someone doing something for the 3rd time with the knowledge of the first 2 behind her. She knew what to do. She did it. She also made plans for the coming year, which was something she did differently now than she had in those early months when planning had felt like making a very long and uncertain list of things she might attempt. Now planning felt like something more accurate, like charting a course she had real information to chart from. She knew the land. She knew the work. She knew what she was capable of and approximately what was possible and where the edges of both of those things were. She was going to expand the slow weekends to include a midwinter weekend, something she had been asked about several times, a weekend in February when the land was resting and the focus would be entirely on the indoors, on bread baking and preserving and the slower crafts of the cold season. She was going to add 2 more guest beds, which meant converting the small study off the hallway into another guest room, a project she had already planned in some detail and which she was looking forward to. She and Patricia were talking about bringing on a part-time assistant at the accounting firm, because the volume of work had grown with the partnership and the additional clients they had taken on, and Clara's time was increasingly divided. She was looking forward to that too, to having someone to develop, to pass knowledge to watch grow in the way she herself had grown. Owen came by in November and they walked the property together in the cold, as they had done since the previous year, and he was in better spirits than he had been in some time, his second full season having gone considerably more smoothly than his first. He said something, standing at the edge of the east field in the low November light, that she thought about afterward. He said that the thing nobody told you about learning a new life was that it took longer than you thought and also less time than it felt like in the middle of it. She understood him exactly. The winter came. The cold settled in and the farm contracted to its winter self, smaller and more internal, but not diminished. The pantry was full. The wood was stacked. The animals were cared for. The house was warm, not just in the physical sense but in the sense of a place that has been inhabited by someone who loves it, who has worked over every inch of it with attention and decision and the simple ongoing commitment of showing up. She sat at the kitchen table on a December evening, with the journal open in front of her, and the lights warm against the window dark, and Pepper at her feet, and the farm quiet all around her. She wrote about the year. She wrote about the slow weekends, and the guests who had come, and what they had said. She wrote about Patricia and the partnership and what that meant for her financial stability, and her sense of herself. She wrote about Elliot, whose Wednesday mornings she valued more than almost anything else in her week. She wrote about Owen and Deja and Louise and the small, real community that had accumulated around her life without her having planned for it. She wrote about Raymond's visit and what she had said and how it had felt, which was not the way she would have predicted it would feel when she was standing at the window 2 years ago watching his truck disappear. She had expected, if he ever came back, to feel something large and complicated. She had felt something simple and clear. She had felt full of her own life and her own work and her own becoming. And there was simply no room for what he was offering, not because she had hardened herself against him, but because she had filled the space with something better. She wrote that she thought this was what healing actually looked like, not the dramatic moment of resolution that stories sometimes suggested, but this, a gradual, cumulative fullness. The slow accretion of real things, a fixed fence, a first seedling, a jar of sauce on a shelf, a guest room with good light, a rocking chair built by your own hands, a jar of honey from a neighbor who came to check that your light was on during the storm. All of it adding up, day by day, to a life so full that there is no corresponding wound, not because the wound has been denied, but because it has been grown over, the way a healthy plant grows over the broken place in a fence, and makes the whole thing stronger than it was before. She closed the journal and sat for a while in the quiet. The house settled around her. Outside, the December night was clear and very cold, and the stars were extraordinary. The kind of stars you can only see from a place far enough from the city's light to let the darkness be what it actually is. She got up after a while and turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs to bed. She passed the guest rooms in the hallway, their doors open, the iron beds neat and ready, the floors glowing in the moonlight through the curtains, the photographs on the walls catching the light. She passed them the way you pass through a place that is entirely familiar and entirely yours, without stopping, without needing to stop, because the familiarity itself is the comfort. She went to her room and got into bed and lay for a moment in the dark, listening to the sounds of the farm at night, the creak of the house, the distant sound of the wind in the trees, the settled, breathing quiet of a place that is inhabited and tended and alive. She thought, before she slept, about the spring, the trays on the windowsill, the first seedlings, the Eastfield waiting, the guests who were already booked for April, more of them than last year, the year stretching ahead, full of the things she knew how to do, and the things she had not yet learned. She was looking forward to it. She had not looked forward to things for a long time before all of this began, and now she looked forward and saw the spring and the fields and the work and the life, and it was enough. It was, if she was honest, more than she had thought was possible for her when she stood at the window 2 years ago and watched the road go empty. Everything she had now she had made. Every piece of it was hers, chosen and built and grown and tended by her own hands and her own will and the simple, steady decision to stay. She had stayed, and in staying she had become someone she was glad to be. She slept. Outside, the farm breathed around her in the cold December night, all its acres and its structures and its sleeping soil, and its 47 points of ongoing life, resting, as it rested every night, in the care of someone who had learned to love it. The road at the bottom of the driveway was quiet and empty. The sign with the new name stood at its edge in the moonlight, solid in its concrete post, waiting for the morning. Clara slept, and she did not dream of leaving. She dreamed of spring. Spring arrived with a particular tenderness that third year, as if the earth itself had decided that this season deserved something extra. The mornings were softer, the light came up slowly and gold, spreading across the farm in a way that seemed to take its time, touching each surface with the considered attention of something that has learned not to rush. Clara stood at the kitchen window with her coffee on the first real morning of it, the morning when the smell coming through the open window was finally and unmistakably spring, and she breathed it in and felt something she could only call gratitude in its purest form. She had a niece named Beth, Helen's youngest daughter, who called in March to ask if she could come for the summer. Beth was 23 and had finished her university degree the previous spring, and had spent the year since trying to figure out what she wanted. moving through a sequence of short-term jobs and shorter-term enthusiasms without landing on anything that felt like a direction. Helen had mentioned, in a careful way, that Beth was struggling a little with the question of purpose, and Clara had heard behind the careful phrasing exactly what Helen was saying, that Beth needed somewhere to be, and something real to do, and someone to be it with. Clara called Beth herself, not in response to the suggestion, but because she had been thinking about it since the moment Helen mentioned it, and said she would love to have her if she wanted to come. She said there would be work, real work, and she named the kind. She said there was a room and decent food and the farm and the company of the animals and whatever she could teach her, which was, she said without false modesty, quite a lot now. Beth arrived on a Sunday morning in late April, driving a car that was somewhat older than it appeared, and carrying a bag that suggested she intended to stay. She was tall like Clara, and had a way of looking at things that reminded Clara of herself at that age, a mix of wanting very much to understand something, and being not quite sure yet what it was she was trying to understand. They had a simple lunch that first day, and then Clara took her around the farm, the same walk she had done with Elliot almost 2 years before, though she walked it now with a different vocabulary and a different pace. She showed Beth the things Elliot had shown her, and the things she had discovered herself since. She talked about the soil and the drainage and what went where and why. She talked about the chickens with the affection she now freely admitted to. She showed her the guest rooms and explained the slow weekends and what they were and why. She showed her the barn and the tractor and the tools and where everything was kept and why. Beth listened with the same attention Clara had given Elliot, and Clara recognized it and was glad to see it. That particular quality of attention, genuinely interested, willing to be changed by what it receives, that was the beginning of learning. She had worn it herself for 2 years and was glad to see it on her niece's face. In the first week, Beth made mistakes. She overwatered the seedlings 2 mornings in a row before Clara caught it, and explained the right amount without scolding. She misidentified which gate the chickens should have access to and spent 15 minutes more than necessary sorting that out. She did not understand at first why the compost was separated the way it was, and Clara sat at the kitchen table with her and drew a simple diagram and explained the system until the logic of it made sense. After the first week, the mistakes became smaller and less frequent. After 2 weeks, Beth moved through the morning routine with the beginning of confidence, not the false confidence of someone performing competence, but the real kind, the kind that comes from having done something enough times to know what you are doing. Clara watched it happen with a feeling she had not fully expected. She had expected to enjoy teaching. She had not expected how much she would recognize in Beth the stages of her own learning, and how much that recognition would move her. When Beth came in from the garden one afternoon in May with her hands dirty and a look on her face that was exactly the look of someone who has done something real and knows it, Clara felt the particular joy of someone who has passed something forward. Elliot took to Beth immediately, in his restrained way, which meant he accepted the coffee she made without comment and occasionally answered her questions with slightly more than his usual economy. She asked him good questions. He appreciated that. The spring planting that year was larger than the previous year and more organized, informed by 2 seasons of experience and supplemented by Beth's considerable energy. They worked in the garden together on the good days and planned on the indoor days, and the kitchen table was often covered in the maps and lists and seed packets that Clara had come to think of as the particular beautiful mess of a farm in preparation for its season. Deja came by twice that month and took an immediate liking to Beth, which surprised neither of them. Deja had a quality of immediately recognizing people who were interesting, and Beth, in her searching and genuinely open way, was interesting. The 3 of them had dinner together one evening in May, all at the kitchen table with the window open and the warm evening air moving through, and the conversation went in every direction with the ease of people who have nothing to prove to each other. Owen came by in June to check the progress of the season and spent an afternoon helping Beth understand the drainage situation on the north side of the property, which Clara had asked him to explain because he had dealt with the identical problem on his own land the previous year. He and Beth talked about it at length, more length than Owen usually spent on any conversation, and Clara sat at the edge of it and thought that the farm was becoming something she had not fully pictured when she was planning it, a gathering place for people who were figuring things out, where the figuring happened in the middle of doing something real. She thought that was actually better than what she had pictured. The slow weekends through the summer were the best yet. 3 years of learning what worked had produced something that ran with a smoothness that felt natural rather than managed. The guests arrived to a place that felt genuinely prepared for them, not in the way of a hotel, but in the way of a house that has been thoughtfully and specifically prepared by a person who wants them to have something real. Clara had a gift for it. She was beginning to accept, for creating the right conditions for people to feel comfortable being themselves. Beth was a natural with the guests, in a way that was different from Clara but complementary. She was closer in age to some of them and had a directness and humor that put people at ease quickly. She remembered names without effort and asked follow-up questions from one day to the next that made people feel they had been genuinely attended to. Clara watched her with the guests and thought that she was seeing something emerge in Beth that Beth herself had not yet fully recognized. A real gift for hospitality, in its truest sense. The ability to make another person feel that they are in the right place. She told Beth this, one evening in late July when the guests had gone to bed and they were washing up in the kitchen, that she thought she had a real gift for this work. Beth was quiet for a moment, running water over the bowls they had used for dinner, and then she said she had not thought of it as a gift. She had thought of it as just talking to people. Clara said that the best gifts always feel like that. Beth thought about that for the rest of the summer, and Clara could see it working in her in the quiet way that things work when they are finding their proper place. By the end of August, Beth had planted and tended and harvested and hosted and cleaned and cooked and fixed and learned and talked and listened and grown in ways that Clara hoped would outlast the summer. She would go back to her ordinary life in September, but she would go back different, and not just because she knew how to set a fence post now, though she did. She would go back having discovered something about the kind of work that satisfies her, and about the kind of place where she feels like herself, and about what it looks like to build something from the ground up. Clara thought that was worth a summer. On Beth's last weekend, they stayed up late sitting on the porch in the September air, and Beth asked Clara something she had been working up to for a while. She asked what it had been like in the beginning, in the very first days, when Raymond had gone and the farm was all in front of her and she had not known if she could do it. Clara sat with the question for a moment. She wanted to answer it honestly. She said it had been very hard. She said that the first weeks had a quality of unreality to them, that she had moved through them with a focus that was in some ways a way of not feeling what there was to feel. She said the feelings came later, in the winter, when there was less to distract her from them, and they had been harder in the night than in the day. She said she had been more frightened than she had shown anyone, and she had been lonelier than she had admitted even to herself. Beth was quiet, listening. Clara said that the thing that had kept her was very simple. It was the decision to stay, made once and not revisited. She said that if she had made the decision every morning, she would not have made it the same way every morning, and eventually she would have made it differently. So she made it once and treated it as settled, and then she did not argue with herself about it. She did what needed doing, and the doing of it changed her, one day at a time, into someone who knew how to do it. She said the farm had not saved her. She had saved herself, by staying and by working and by being willing to learn things she did not know. The farm was just the place where she had done it. Beth was quiet for a while after that. Then she said she thought she understood. Clara thought that she probably did. October arrived with the same golden, generative clarity it always brought, and the farm entered its rhythm of harvest and preparation, and the particular beauty of late season that Clara had now seen twice, and still found arresting every time. She moved through the days with a confidence that was entirely grounded, not the false confidence of someone who has stopped expecting difficulty, but the real kind, the kind that comes from knowing you can handle difficulty when it comes because you have handled it before. The accounts at Patricia's firm were more organized that year than they had ever been, partly because of the part-time assistant Clara had brought on, a methodical young man named Ian, who had an accountant's mind and a quiet manner that suited the work and the office perfectly. He had been trained by Clara with the same direct, unapologetic method she used for everything. This is how it is done, this is why. Ask me if something is unclear. He was a good learner and she was glad to have him. Patricia came to the farm for lunch one Saturday in October, which was a first. She arrived in her careful, precise car and walked the property with Clara with the eyes of someone encountering something she had heard about but wanted to see for herself. She stopped at the kitchen garden, still producing in its late autumn way, and looked at it for a while without saying anything. Then she said that it was extraordinary what Clara had made here. Clara said she had had a lot of help. Patricia looked at her and said, with the directness she brought to everything, that she had had guidance but she had done the making herself, and those were not the same thing. Clara accepted that. She was getting better at accepting true things about herself without deflecting them. They ate at the kitchen table with the window open to the October air, and the conversation was wide-ranging in the way of two people who have spent enough time working together to have built a genuine regard for each other. Patricia talked about her plans for the years ahead, the consultancy work she intended to take on after the full transition, the traveling she and her husband had been talking about for 30 years. Clara talked about the slow weekends and where she wanted to take them, the winter weekend she was planning, the possibility of a small workshop series in the spring. Patricia said that Clara had turned out to be considerably more interesting than most people she had brought into a business partnership, and she said it in the tone she used when she meant something completely. Clara said she had turned out to be considerably more interesting than she had previously suspected herself to be. Patricia laughed, and the sound was warm in the kitchen, and outside the October light moved across the farm in that long, tender way, touching everything it reached. The winter of that third year was the gentlest so far. Not because the weather was mild, it was not. It was a proper winter in every respect. But Clara moved through it with such ease and confidence that it did not press against her the way the first one had, or even the second. She knew what to do and she did it, and the farm held up and the house was warm and the pantry was full and the animals were well and there was nothing in the winter that asked more of her than she was now capable of giving. She used the quiet months for the projects she looked forward to all year. She built a bookcase for the living room from a kit she had bought in the autumn, taking her time with it over several weekends, fitting the pieces together with the attention to detail that distinguished a thing built properly from a thing merely assembled. She repainted the study that she was converting to a third guest room, a warm color, and put in the third iron bed she had been collecting toward for months. She refinished the porch floor, which had needed it since the previous spring, and the new surface caught the winter light and made the porch a place she liked to stand even in the cold. She read a great deal that winter. She had always read, but she read more purposefully now, because she had enough understanding of the farm and the work that she could read about things and understand where they fit into what she was doing. She read about sustainable growing practices and what they could mean for the long-term health of the land. She read about the economics of small farm businesses, which was both practical and absorbing. She read a book about the history of the county that made the land she was standing on feel deep and storied in a way she had not fully felt before. She and Elliot read the same book that winter, in sequence, him first and then her, and they talked about it on the Wednesday mornings in a way that covered considerably more ground than their conversations usually did. He told her things about the county's history that were not in the book, things passed down from his own parents and grandparents, about the families who had farmed this land and what had happened to them over the generations. Some of it was hard. Land history is rarely simple or kind across the long view, but it was real, and she wanted to know it. Because the land she was farming had a history that preceded her and would outlast her, and she felt it was right to know what that history was. She put his stories in her journal, careful and exact. She did not want them to be lost. Owen had a plan for the following year that involved a small collaboration with Clara, a shared growing arrangement for a particular type of specialty herb that had become interesting to both of them. They spent a Saturday afternoon in February working through the details at her kitchen table, both of them with their notebooks and their calculations, and arrived by late afternoon at a plan that made sense and that they both felt confident about. It was a good afternoon's work, and when Owen left he said he was glad he had gone down the wrong road. She asked him what he meant. He said the first time he had come to her farm, 2 years ago, he had come down the wrong road by accident and arrived in her driveway when he had meant to go somewhere else. He had almost turned around. He had been slightly embarrassed by the error, but he had knocked on the door and she had been there, and it had turned out to be the beginning of something useful, and he was glad he had not turned around. Clara said she was glad too. She thought about the things that happened by accident and turned out to be the things that mattered. The deed left on a kitchen table, the neighbor with the jar of honey, the wrong road that turns out to be the right one. None of it was planned. All of it had been essential. She was thinking about that, sitting alone at the kitchen table after Owen left, when Pepper came and put his head on her knee and looked up at her with his dark, even eyes. She put her hand on his head. He was older now. The fur around his muzzle had gone gray. He was still solid and steady and present, still showing up in the morning and following her through the day and lying at the foot of the stairs in the evening, still choosing, in whatever way a dog makes choices, to be here with her. She sat with her hand on his warm head and felt the quiet fullness of the evening, the clean, cold February outside, the warm kitchen around her, the journal on the table with its 2 years of entries, the farm resting outside every window. She felt how far she had come, and how much had changed, and how none of the change had been easy, and how all of it had been worth it. She did not need to write that in the journal. She already knew it. It was written in the fence posts and the garden beds and the guest rooms and the refinished floors, and the jar of honey on the second shelf, and the chair she had built with her own hands, and the sign at the bottom of the driveway with her name on it. It was written in everything she had made, and she had made a great deal. The winter moved toward spring with the gradual, reliable movement of a season that knows where it is going. The days lengthened a few minutes at a time. The mornings lightened. The smell of the air began to change again, that coming alive smell that she had now learned to recognize as the land making its announcement. Something is about to begin. She ordered seeds in February. She spread them on the kitchen table and organized them by planting time, and made her list of what went where. The list was longer and more detailed than the first year's, and the confidence behind it was grounded in things she actually knew, not hope and determination alone but experience. 2 full seasons of it, the knowledge of what this specific land did when treated in specific ways. She was a farmer in the full sense now, not a beginner finding her feet, not someone surviving on determination and Elliot's guidance, but a person who understood her land and worked it well, and could plan forward with confidence. That had taken time. It had taken more time than she had expected in the beginning, but it had come, the way all real things come, through the accumulation of days spent doing the actual work. Vera wrote to confirm a weekend in May. 2 new groups had booked for June through a connection that Louise had made at her book club, a chain of recommendation that Clara had been delighted to discover, still moved in the same old human way. One person telling another person, the word spreading by trust. She had not advertised beyond the leaflet and the sign at the driveway. She had not needed to. The farm found the people it was meant to find. She sat at the kitchen table on a morning in late February, with the seed packets in front of her and her coffee beside her, and the window showing the winter yard, and the empty garden beds, and the fence lines that she had built and maintained over 2 years of seasons. She looked at all of it, then she looked at the seeds on the table. The small, dry, patient things that held inside them everything they were going to become, waiting only for the right conditions. She thought about the woman she had been. She thought about the woman she was now. She thought about the farm that had been left to her in ruins and was now, unmistakably, alive. She thought about all the people who had moved through it and taken pieces of it with them, carrying the farm's work and warmth out into the world in ways she would never fully know. She was grateful for all of it. She was grateful for the hard year and the cold winter and the frozen pipes and the weight of the fence posts and the hours in the garden and the guests at the kitchen table and the Wednesday mornings with Elliot and the lunch with Patricia, and the first seedling on the windowsill that had appeared like a small green declaration in a world that had asked her to be braver than she knew she was. She was grateful, most of all, for the decision to stay, made once, on a morning when leaving would have been easier, and kept every day since without revisiting it. That decision was the origin of everything. Without it, there was nothing. With it, there was this: the farm in the morning light, and the seeds on the table, and the spring coming up through the cold ground, and the life that she had built from the inside out, bone by bone and board by board and season by season, until it was solid enough to stand in and real enough to share. She picked up the first seed packet. She opened her notebook to the planting calendar she had prepared. Outside, across the bare garden beds and the waiting fields, the February morning was cold and clear and full of what was coming. She began. There is a particular kind of morning that belongs only to the farm, and only to those who have earned it through all the harder mornings that came before it. It arrives without announcement, without drama, without any signal that it is going to be different from the ordinary mornings that surround it. You wake up and the light is a certain quality through the curtains, and the air through the cracked window smells of the season in its fullest sense, and you know, in the way the body knows things before the mind catches up, that this morning is one of those. Clara had one of those mornings in the spring of the 3rd year, on a Wednesday that began the same way all her Wednesdays began, with early coffee and the farm journal and the soft movement of light across the kitchen floor. She sat at the table and was very quiet, and the quiet was the particular quality she had come to know as the farm's best offering, not empty but full, the fullness of a living place going about its business, the chickens already audible from the yard, the wind in the trees at the east edge, the house settling around her as it always settled in the cooling morning. She had been on this farm for 2.5 years. She had arrived knowing nothing about it. She had learned everything she needed to know, one season at a time, one problem at a time, one solved problem after another, until the farm was no longer a collection of difficulties but a known and tended thing, a living system she understood and cared for with the particular care that comes from genuine connection. She thought sometimes about what she would say to the woman she had been on the first morning, the one with the cold coffee and the note in the envelope, and the weight of the ending pressing down on everything. She did not think she would say much. The woman she had been on that morning did not need advice. She needed to make the decision she was going to make, and she was going to make it, and all the advice in the world would not have made the work easier or the winter shorter or the learning faster. Those things took the time they took. What she might have said, if she had been able to, was this: you are more capable than you know. Not in the way that people say that to encourage, meaning they believe it but cannot prove it. In a factual, demonstrable, eventual way. You are going to fix things you do not yet know how to fix. You are going to grow things you have never grown. You are going to have conversations with people you have not yet met that will change you, and you are going to change them, and none of it will happen the way you imagined, but all of it will be real. She would have said, "The farm is the right place. Staying is the right decision. The work is hard and the winter is long, and you will cry into the dark of an empty house on more than one night, and there is nothing wrong with that. You will also stand in the East Field at 7 in the morning in August, and feel something you cannot name that is bigger than happiness and more durable. You will make things with your hands that will outlast the pain of what is ending now. You will find people who are worth finding. You will find yourself, which is the most important thing, and the most surprising." She would have said, "It is going to be all right. Better than all right. It is going to be yours." Elliot arrived at 8:30 on that Wednesday morning, as he always did, with his steady knock at the back door, and the specific patience of a man who has nowhere else to be, and no urgency about getting there. She made fresh coffee and they sat at the kitchen table in the morning light, and the conversation moved in its easy way over the things that were growing, and the things that needed attention, and the weather coming in from the west, which Elliot could read in the morning sky better than any forecast. At one point there was a silence between them that was entirely comfortable, the kind of silence that happens between people who have been talking together long enough to know that silence is not absence. Clara looked out the window at the garden and the fields beyond and the sky above them, all of it familiar and all of it still, capable of surprising her with its beauty. Elliot looked out too, and then he said, in his particular way, that the place was doing well. She looked at it. She thought about the 2.5 years of work that had produced what she was looking at. The fence lines, the straightened barn, the kitchen garden, which would come alive again in a few weeks as the spring moved through it, the guest rooms upstairs, the pantry shelves, the 20 chickens in their yard, the tractor that ran, the books on the shelf, the rocking chairs on the porch. She said yes, it was. Elliot nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when something was simply and accurately true. He finished his coffee. He put the cup down in the way he always put it down. He got up and said he should be going, which was what he always said. And she walked with him to the back door, and he put on his jacket, and stepped out into the spring morning, and walked across the yard to the gap in the fence that divided their properties, the gap she had specifically left when she rebuilt that section of fence, because the gap was where Elliot came through, and she did not want a gate that required opening. She watched him cross the yard and go through the gap and walk across his own field toward his house. She watched until he was a small figure in the distance, moving steadily, unhurried, a man who has spent 50 years learning a piece of land and knows every step of it. Then she turned and looked at hers. The morning was clear, and the air had the particular quality of a spring morning in that 3rd year, the quality of something she had learned and earned and arrived at through all the seasons before it. The farm breathed around her in the sunlight. The chickens moved in their yard with the purposeful ease of creatures who are entirely at home. The garden beds waited. The East Field waited. The whole forward length of the season waited, full of work she knew how to do, and things she was still going to learn, and mornings like this one, that would come when she was not expecting them, and settle over the day like a gift. She went inside and picked up her notebook and her coffee, and came back to the porch and sat in the rocking chair she had built, the first one, the one on the left side of the porch. And she opened the notebook and looked at the planting calendar and the weeks list, and felt the good weight of purposeful work ahead of her. The lavender along the steps was fuller this year than last. By July it would be the border she had imagined when she planted it, soft and fragrant, and unmistakably intentional. She looked at it with the satisfaction of someone who has watched something grow from a small, uncertain beginning into something that was exactly what she had meant to make. That was what all of it was, the farm, the life, the person she had become in the making of them. All of it was exactly what she had meant to make, not in the sense that she had planned it, she had not planned most of it, but in the sense that it was made by her choices and her hands and her particular combination of stubbornness and curiosity and willingness to learn. It had her character in it, the way made things always carry the character of the person who made them. She had made it. She was still making it. She would go on making it, season after season, learning more every year about this piece of land, and what it could do, and what she could do with it. And the making would continue to make her, the way it always had, the way it had from the very first morning. The sign at the bottom of the driveway stood in the spring morning light with her name on it, the name she had painted and set in concrete and put there, as a declaration that she was still here, and this was hers, and she was not going anywhere. She was not going anywhere. She opened her notebook to the day's list and picked up her pen, and the morning spread out ahead of her, clear and full, and worth every difficult thing that had come before it. Worth the cold and the frozen pipes, and the long dark winter nights, and the weight of fence posts, and the afternoons that had tried her, and the mornings that had tested her, and all the moments when she had not known if she could do this, and had done it anyway. One season at a time, one day at a time, one morning at a time, beginning again and again and again, until the beginning was simply where she lived, here, on this land, in this life, with her name on the sign at the bottom of the road and her hands already reaching for the first thing on the list. Here,